we shall examine Perturabo, greatest strategist of the Imperium, genius of the highest order, whose mastery of the machinery of war was matched only by his failure to connect with others. Perturabo stands among the most tragic figures among the Primarchs, his genius and capabilities undermined by his inability to find fulfillment or connection. How about a brief overview before we get into the detailed stuff, huh? Perturabo grew up on Olympia, a vaguely Greek-styled world of city-states steeped in militaristic tradition and constant warfare. Despite his brilliance, Perturabo never truly integrated with the people of Olympia, and he often saw them as beneath him. Perturabo lacked the validation and understanding that could have bridged his growing detachment from others. Thus, he grew arrogance as a defense mechanism against loneliness. Perturabo's talent for engineering and obsession with fortifications and sieges became a defining feature of his leadership, symbolizing his need for control in an unpredictable galaxy. Perturabo's strategic mind and technical expertise were unmatched among the Primarchs, maybe only being matched by the Emperor himself, making him indispensable during the Great Crusade. However, his arrogance made his brilliance a double-edged sword, earning him both admiration and isolation. Perturabo felt overshadowed by his brothers who received greater recognition, and this is perhaps justified. This is worsened by the Emperor's treatment of him, which, as with many of the Primarchs, lacked the warmth or understanding that they needed. This wasn't helped by the absence of camaraderie and mutual respect from his peers. It's understandable lack of camaraderie. He was a huge asshole all the time, but he did need some help there. His constant comparison of himself to others mirrors the universal human struggle with self-worth, particularly when validation seems unattainable. Perturabo's greatest unmet emotional need was to feel valued, not just for his utility, though that would have helped, but as an individual. His tragedy lies in his inability to recognize or seek out genuine connection, focusing instead on external validation, which he also did not receive. Perturabo's story, like Fulgrim, warns against the dangers of perfectionism, particularly when it becomes a substitute for emotional fulfillment. His relentless drive alienated those who might have supported him, even those within his own legion, leaving him to spiral into bitterness and ruin. And honestly, he's a pretty straightforward traitor Primarch to understand. That's about it for his emotional landscape. Perturabo's narrative is a sad exploration of the cost of genius untempered by empathy. His inability to connect with others left him vulnerable to the temptations of rebellion and destruction. A child who is not warmed at the campfire will burn down the village. This is one of the tragedies among the mythos of the Primarchs. Okay, let's examine his early life in greater detail and compare his home planet with those of a couple other Primarchs. How did his upbringing shape his character? Can we better understand him by comparing Olympia with Macragge, or by contrasting Olympia with Fenris? Olympia was a harsh, mountainous world of city-states locked in perpetual strife. Its rigid hierarchies, emphasis on martial prowess, and culture of dominance deeply influenced Perturabo. Unlike, for example, Macragge or Inuit, Olympia was a study of contradictions. It was a civilization advanced enough to maintain complex architecture and fortifications and stuff, but it was so consumed by internecine wars that it could not make any real progress due to the lack of unity. This backdrop shows us a few ways that Perturabo was shaped. First, pragmatism, and ruthlessness even. The constant warfare demanded a practical approach to survival, and thus Perturabo learned early to value efficiency, strength, and iron control. His preference for fortifications and siegecraft reflected the environment's demand for unyielding defenses. A Jagatai Khan-style mobility warfare strategy would not have worked in those mountains, for example. But despite his brilliance, Perturabo saw himself as fundamentally separate from the Olympians. Their petty squabbles and inability to appreciate his intellect bred a sense of superiority, but also deep loneliness. We can see thus the metaphor of the big mountain ranges of Olympia separating different people, as similarly Perturabo being separated from the people. And on a world where failure often meant death, Perturabo internalized perfectionism. He knew that perfection was not just a goal, but sometimes a necessity. His unforgiving nature, both towards himself and others, was a direct result of Olympia's merciless environment, just as much as it was a product of his father's terrible parenting style. Macragge, meanwhile, the home of Rabuta Guilliman, is in some ways a contrast to Olympia, and in some ways similar. While both worlds had advanced civilizations and strong martial traditions, their cultural values and conditions shaped the respective Primarchs differently. Macragge was a world striving for unity and order. Yes, Guilliman gained his first giant martial experience fighting against a rebellion, and his second martial experience fighting against treason. But overall, his upbringing had emphasized cooperation, governance, and long-term planning. His adoptive father, Connor, instilled ideals of service and the greater good, whereas Olympia was divided and chaotic, teaching Perturabo that domination of others and iron control of those already under your control were the only paths to stability. Meanwhile, his father was a huge asshole. He didn't have a nurturing figure like Connor, so he was left emotionally stunted. Guilliman's talents were recognized and celebrated by his people. He had validation. This reinforced his sense of purpose and belonging. Whereas Perturabo's genius went unappreciated by the warring factions of Olympia and even by his own father. His father saw him as a particularly useful tool, This fostered resentment because he did not have validation. He grew a belief that others were incapable of understanding him and therefore incapable of appreciating him. Guilliman thus became an optimist, believing in the potential for humanity to achieve greatness through unity and discipline, whereas Perturabo became a cynic, convinced that humanity's flaws necessitated authoritarian control. Guilliman inspired people to do their best. Perturabo killed them when they did not. Okay, now what about Fenris, a world so unlike Olympia that it should only provide contrast, right? I mean, Fenris, the home of Leman Russ, could almost not be more different from Olympia. It was a savage, tribal world with low technology, where survival was dictated by the strength of a man's back. Fenris shaped Russ in ways that show us the differences between him and Perturabo in clearer light. There was strength in simplicity. Russ grew up in two societies that valued personal strength, loyalty, and honor, one with the wolves, one with the humans of the House of Russ. The lack of advanced civilization meant that survival depended on communal bonds and raw physical prowess and ability to get things done. Whereas Perturabo's environment lauded intellectual achievement and engineering over physical strength, but it also fostered intense competition, isolation rather than camaraderie. Russ was deeply integrated into the tribe, the people of Fenris, forming bonds of loyalty and mutual respect, while Perturabo's detachment from the Olympians left him isolated and emotionally disconnected. He became the master of his craft of fortification, technology, machinery, strategy and warfare, architecture even, and nobody cared about him. Russ believed in the strength of the individual and the strength of the group, tempered by honor and tradition. Perturabo viewed humanity, which failed to meet his emotional needs, as fundamentally flawed, requiring strict oversight to prevent its own self-destruction. What can we learn about Perturabo from these avenues of inquiry? Well, I believe that by comparing Olympia to Macragge and to Fenris, we can gain a clearer understanding of how Perturabo's environment shaped his personality and decisions. Whereas Guilliman's genius and brilliance was celebrated, and whereas Russ's strength was admired and lauded, Perturabo's intellect isolated him. This lack of validation contributed to his bitterness and his ultimate fall. Unlike Guilliman's optimism in the strength of institutions, or Russ's optimism in the strength of family, Perturabo's upbringing in a fractured, warlike world made him deeply cynical about human nature. He saw humanity as something to be managed, not uplifted, much like how his own father saw him as a tool to be used and not a son. Perturabo's relentless pursuit of perfection can be seen as a defense mechanism against the problems of his world. It's a way to assert control in a chaotic and ungrateful environment. But this drive, while admirable and understandable, did end up alienating him from others. The lack of a nurturing figure like Connor or the tribal bonds of Fenris left Perturabo emotionally stunted. His inability to form meaningful connections, because he was never able to form a meaningful connection with his father or adoptive family, ultimately became his greatest weakness. By juxtaposing Perturabo's story with those of Guilliman and Russ, we can thus see the profound effect of the environment and of familial validation on the Primarchs' development. Perturabo's tragedy lies in his failure to overcome the scars left on him by Olympia, a world that demanded he do his best, but offered no appreciation or understanding in return when he did his best. Perturabo's eventual resentment of the Emperor is heavily foreshadowed by his troubled relationship with his adoptive father on Olympia. This dynamic serves as a stark contrast to Guilliman's relationship with Connor and Guilliman's later relationship with the Emperor. By examining these relationships, we can see recurring patterns and thematic parallels that emphasize the importance of emotional needs and validation in the shaping of the Primarchs. Perturabo was taken in by Damachos, the tyrant of Logos, I believe that's how that is pronounced, who sought to use the Primarch's talents to consolidate his own power. We can see a similar, although worse, relationship later when we talk about Lorgar and Corpheron. Anyway, the relationship between Perturabo and Damachos was characterized by conditional acceptance. Damachos valued Perturabo's abilities, but he did not understand or connect with him on an emotional level. His treatment of Perturabo was utilitarian, using him as a tool rather than seeing him as a son. Does this sound familiar? This is just the Emperor on a tiny, terrible world. Perturabo's intellectual and emotional isolation was exacerbated by this transactional dynamic, leaving him with unmet needs for recognition and genuine care for each other. Perturabo's brilliance went unappreciated by both Damachos and the broader Olympian populace, who saw him as distant and inscrutable. This lack of understanding thus bred resentment in Perturabo, who viewed their lack of gratitude as proof of humanity's flaws. I'll say that's vaguely like the Grinch. Anyway, his disdain for the weakness and short-sightedness of those around him began there on Olympia, and eventually extended to the Emperor, who he perceived as similarly flawed and dismissive, and not without reason. When Perturabo eventually returned to Olympia as its conqueror later, right before the start of the Horus Heresy, spoiler alert, he massacred its population as punishment, not really for that rebellion, but for their earlier rejection and rebellion. This act symbolized his ultimate rejection of the conditional acceptance and exploitation he had suffered under Damocos. I'd like to say that this is very similar to Conrad Kurz destroying Nostromo. In contrast, Guilliman's relationship with his adoptive father, Connor, was one of mutual respect and genuine affection. He had unconditional support. Connor recognized Guilliman as his son. Yes, he saw Guilliman's brilliance and nurtured it, encouraging him to apply his talents for the benefit of all, but he loved him separately from that. Their bond was built on shared ideals and mutual understanding, and it was also built on love for each other, thus providing Guilliman with the emotional stability he needed. This support allowed Guilliman to develop a strong sense of duty and belief in the potential of humanity, traits which defined his later leadership. Connor's teachings shaped Guilliman's worldview, emphasizing governance, order, and compassion for one's subjects. Guilliman carried these lessons into his relationship with the Emperor, seeing him as a continuation of Connor's ideals, which maybe the Emperor didn't always deserve that sort of view. But it was very charitable of Guilliman to see the best parts of his father in the Emperor. So we can see then, while Perturabo's rejection of Damocos foreshadowed his rebellion against the Emperor, Guilliman's loyalty to Connor set the foundation for his enduring faith in the Emperor's vision, even after the death of the Emperor. To say again, the relationship with their first father was similar to how their relationship with the Emperor would be. Just as Damocos used Perturabo for his abilities without addressing his emotional needs, the Emperor valued Perturabo's strategic genius and martial aptitude, but failed to recognize or address his growing resentment because he refused to see the Primarchs as his sons. This neglect reinforced Perturabo's sense of alienation and eventual betrayal. But the Emperor, much like Connor, entrusted Guilliman with great responsibilities while validating Guilliman's efforts, thus reinforcing Guilliman's loyalty. While their relationship was not without tension, the Emperor's trust in Guilliman mirrored Connor's earlier faith in him. Perturabo's unmet need for recognition and understanding from the Emperor echoed his experience with Damocos. His descent into bitterness and rebellion can be seen as an extension of those earlier struggles. Guilliman's need for purpose and validation were met both by Connor and the Emperor, allowing him to remain steadfast in his duties, even during moments of doubt. These contrasting relationships underscore a central theme. The Primarchs' emotional needs played a pivotal role in shaping their paths. Those who found validation and guidance were more likely to remain loyal, while those who faced neglect or exploitation were more prone to rebellion. We can see this with Perturabo and Conrad Kurz and Mortarion and Angron. Do you get where I'm going with this? I'm calm now. Perturabo's relationship with Damikos not only foreshadowed his eventual resentment of the Emperor, but also highlighted the consequences of neglecting emotional needs. We can see this as contrast of how Guilliman's relationship with Connor demonstrated the power of nurturing and support to foster loyalty and resilience. These parallels show us that the fates of the Primarchs were shaped as much by their environments and their relationships as by their innate qualities. There's one more relationship we should talk about from Olympia before we jump into meeting the Emperor and stuff. So Perturabo had a foster brother, Ondos. Perturabo had a foster brother, Ondos, who was the greatest human, rather than transhuman, genius that Olympia had ever seen. A Da Vinci of his time. Just absolutely incredible. And despite never measuring up to Perturabo's standards, despite never meeting the incredible deeds that Perturabo did, Ondos still had a drive to compete with Perturabo. And Perturabo did not like that. How dare he think he might be as good as me, you know? So one time, Ondos challenged Perturabo to a competition of art, making statues. And they both made great statues, but Ondos's was better. For once, Ondos was victorious, and Perturabo knew it. And before the statues could be judged, and Perturabo officially named the loser of that competition, Perturabo blew up both statues. This tells you everything you need to know about Perturabo's character. But I hope you'll watch the rest of the video anyway. Anyway, on to the Emperor. The meeting between Perturabo and the Emperor is rich in thematic elements that reflect Perturabo's isolation, his unmet emotional needs, and his eventual trajectory towards bitterness and rebellion. Comparing and contrasting it with the meetings of other Primarchs can show us some similarities in the Emperor's approach to his sons, and the unique elements that defined their relationships. When the Emperor arrived on Olympia, Perturabo recognized the Emperor's greatness, he recognized their kinship, and he submitted to him without outward resistance. This interaction was marked by a cold formality that lacked the warmth or connection seen in some of the other Primarchs' meetings. We can see, thus, the theme of isolation developing. Perturabo immediately recognized the Emperor as his creator, and he recognized the lack of any emotional bond from the Emperor. The Emperor, for his part, valued Perturabo for his strategic genius, but failed to address his need for recognition and connection. First impressions matter. This first meeting reinforced Perturabo's perception of himself as a tool for others to use, continuing the pattern established in his relationship with his adoptive father, Damikos. The Emperor acknowledged Perturabo's brilliance, but did so in a manner which was perfunctory, not personal. Perturabo was accustomed to being undervalued by his father, so he interpreted this as further proof that his worth to others was tied solely to his utility. This, then, foreshadows his betrayal. Perturabo's submission to the Emperor was pragmatic rather than heartfelt. This lack of emotional connection left him vulnerable to feelings of resentment and neglect, and meant that if he was ever able to be persuaded that the pragmatic choice was to rebel by, for example, Lorgar or Horus, then he would rebel. That would be his decision. He had no emotional attachment to the Emperor or the Imperium. Whereas when Rogel Dorn met the Emperor, he emphasized duty and loyalty. We'll get to Dorn later, but generally speaking, like Perturabo, Dorn was recognized for his utilitarian value. In Dorn's case, his organizational prowess and leadership of Inuit. Both of them were immediately assigned tasks that aligned with their abilities. And the Emperor treated both Primarchs with a degree of emotional distance, focusing on their roles within the Great Crusade. In contrast, while Dorn's stoic personality allowed him to find fulfillment in duty, Perturabo's pride and need for recognition, which he never received, left him feeling undervalued. Dorn viewed the Emperor's expectations as an honor, but Perturabo, perhaps rightly, saw them as a burden. This difference in perspective influenced their respective paths, while Dorn remained loyal because of it, and Perturabo turned against the Emperor because of how he viewed it. Meanwhile, Leman Russ's meeting with the Emperor was characterized by mutual respect and camaraderie in the context of the cultural traditions of Fenris. This was a stark contrast to Perturabo's experience. Both Russ and Perturabo were acknowledged for their martial prowess, with the Emperor recognizing their unique strengths, and both were quickly integrated into the Great Crusade and given tasks that played to their abilities. But in contrast, while Russ and the Emperor bonded over their shared warrior ethos and willingness to participate in the cultural traditions of Fenris, and while Russ thus demonstrated loyalty and respect from the outset, Perturabo remained emotionally distant, seeing the Emperor as just another figure who valued him solely for his utility. Not unlike how Angron saw the Emperor as yet another slave master. The Emperor's warmth toward Russ helped to foster a sense of loyalty and belonging, but his more utility-based approach to Perturabo exacerbated the Primarch's feelings of isolation. We can thus see a thematic difference across these meetings. The Emperor's treatment of the Primarchs reflected a balance or lack thereof between emotional connection and utility-based expediency. Those Primarchs who felt a genuine bond with the Emperor at their first meeting, like Russ and Sanguinius, were more likely to remain loyal, whereas those who were valued only for what they could do for the Emperor, like Angron and Perturabo, were more likely to rebel later. This is not an ironclad rule, but it is a tendency, a propensity. Perturabo's pride clashed with the Emperor's impersonal approach, leading to feelings of neglect and resentment, whereas Guilliman and Dorn, for example, were able to subsume their pride in service of the Emperor's vision. The nature of the initial meeting of a Primarch and the Emperor foreshadows the Primarch's ultimate fates. It showed us the tendency of their personality. When there was emotional distance, when there were unmet needs, they tended to not be fixed later. You could see them at the outset, and they just grew from there. Strong bonds, like with Russ, fostered enduring loyalty. Perturabo's meeting with the Emperor thus shows us, again, the tragedy of unmet emotional needs and how first impressions foreshadow a Primarch's later loyalty or rebellion. When compared to Rogel Dorn and Leman Russ, Perturabo's experience highlights the importance of emotional connection in the Primarch's relationships with their father. The Emperor's inability or unwillingness to meet Perturabo's deeper needs is emblematic of the broader failures that contributed to the heresy. We have previously examined the apparent correlation between length of acclimation time and how soon a Primarch was found. We've also examined some exceptions to this trend. Of note for Perturabo specifically was that his short period of acclimation was accompanied by a profound disrespect for the Adeptus Mechanicus. Meanwhile, Ferrus Manus found early, had minimal acclimation time, but the Iron Hands developed close ties to the Adeptus Mechanicus. It seems that their respective attitudes toward the Adeptus Mechanicus were not a result of how much contact they had with them after being found by the Emperor. Rather, this difference suggests that their attitudes towards the Mechanicum were shaped by deeper aspects of their personalities and early experiences, rather than by their amount of exposure to the Mechanicum during their transition into Imperial service. How about we give this a little look-see? Perturabo's disdain for the Adeptus Mechanicus appears rooted in his own pride and perfectionism. He sees in the Mechanicum a bunch of idiots unwilling to grasp the greatness which he has decided to grasp. Perturabo saw himself as the supreme master of technological and strategic knowledge regarding external institutions, including the Adeptus Mechanicus, as being his inferiors. He was quite self-reliant and felt that he could not trust them to be worth his time, which is fair. His genius and perfectionism led him to view the Mechanicus' dogmatic approach to technology as intellectually stifling and unworthy of his respect. He was correct. On Olympia, his early life was marked by constant conflict and a culture of utilitarianism. Whenever he made some new technological marvel, everyone loved it. There was a pragmatic and uncompromising worldview. When he made something useful, it was regarded based off of its use. When he encountered the Mechanicum, their ritualistic practices were immediately and obviously superfluous and foolish to him, and their concern about his use of innovation was just insulting. Now, Perturabo's relatively short period of acclimation time denied him the opportunity to form cooperative relationships with key imperial institutions such as the Mechanicum, but his dismissive attitude meant he probably wasn't going to do that no matter how much time he had. It just happens to be that the short period he had entrenched his existing attitude. In contrast, Ferrus Manus fostered a strong relationship with the Mechanicum, becoming a defining feature of the Iron Hands Legion and later successor chapters. They had something of a shared philosophy. The Iron Hands' emphasis on self-improvement through technology resonated with the Mechanicus, even though the Mechanicus was generally opposed to innovation and improvement of the technology, except through finding what had been lost. Ultimately, the Mechanicum's reverence for machinery allowed for the Iron Hands to have a natural alliance with them. Ferrus Manus did not share the exact same views as his legion, but he still saw value in the Mechanicum's technological expertise, and he appreciated their practical contributions to the Great Crusade. Ferrus Manus valued the Mechanicum not just as allies, but as a resource for advancing his legion's capabilities, whereas Perturabo saw the Mechanicum as holding the Imperium back, and therefore as holding his legion back. By being open to collaboration, Ferrus Manus allowed for mutual respect to develop between the Iron Hands and the Mechanicum. Perturabo's arrogance, meanwhile, prevented such an alliance from forming. I'm not completely confident that Ferrus Manus was in the right here. I will say, though, that Ferrus Manus's confidence in his own abilities did not manifest as the kind of intellectual hubris displayed by Perturabo. He was more willing to work with others who shared his goals, even if they differed in methodology. Perturabo, however, was right on the deeper sense that the Mechanicum was so flawed that they needed to be scrapped and rebuilt from scratch. There was nothing worth saving. This divergence between Perturabo and Ferrus Manus highlights the importance of personality and early experiences in shaping their attitudes. Perturabo viewed external authorities, like the Mechanicum, who tried to impose their will upon him, as rivals to his own supremacy, whereas Ferrus Manus took a more cooperative view and saw them as partners in the pursuit of their goals. Perturabo's combative upbringing on Olympia and his own hubristic idea that he had no upper limits on what he could achieve predisposed him to see a relationship with the Mechanicum as a zero-sum game, where elevating them would diminish his own standing, and allowing them to be anything but brutally crushed politically would lead to his own abilities being capped. Ferrus's focus on personal improvement allowed for greater cooperation, allowing for a non-zero-sum interaction. Perturabo's brief acclimation period, like we said earlier, may have exacerbated his existing isolation and prevented him from seeing value in cooperating with the Mechanicum. But though Ferrus's openness allowed him to integrate the Mechanicum's strengths into his legion's identity, it also integrated the Mechanicum's weaknesses into the Iron Hand's identity. This contrast between Perturabo and Ferrus Manus thus underscores the theme of unmet emotional needs among the Primarchs, complicated by the idea that Perturabo may have been right. Perturabo's pride and need for recognition went unaddressed, driving a wedge between him and potential allies like the Mechanicum, but also maybe they weren't worthwhile as allies. Ferrus Manus managed to form meaningful partnerships, reflecting his ability to channel his needs into constructive relationships, but his relationship with the Mechanicum ultimately caused some of the weaknesses of that dogmatic and backwards-looking organization to find a home within the heart of the Iron Hand's Legion. Perturabo's distaste for imperial institutions extended beyond just the Adeptus Mechanicus, and reflected a broader pattern of resentment and condescension towards any organization or individual he perceived as unworthy of his intellect or contributions. This attitude was rooted in his perfectionism, his unrelenting pride, and his unmet emotional needs, which manifested in several ways during his interactions with other institutions and other figures in the Imperium. Perturabo had a bad relationship with the Imperial Army, later called the Imperial Guard. He showed little respect for them, viewing its officers and soldiers as inefficient and incapable compared to his Marines, and ultimately viewed them as disposable assets. He preferred to take on tasks himself, relying solely on the Iron Warriors, as he did not trust others to execute his plans to his exacting standards. But when he needed extra numbers, he just threw the Imperial Army into the mix, like pieces on a game board, where other Primarchs sometimes saw the Imperial Army as valuable allies, exemplified by Sanguinius defending the Eternity Gate. Perturabo regarded them as tools at best and liabilities at worst. This approach created friction with army commanders, who found themselves marginalized and overruled in joint operations, and saw their men sent into meat grinders just to give the Iron Warriors a slight advantage. Later in the Crusade, being assigned to work alongside the Iron Warriors was seen by Imperial Army commanders as something of a punishment detail. You fucked up. Now your regiment is going to go fight under Perturabo, and many of you are going to die. All right, let's talk about the Administratum. Perturabo viewed the Administratum as overly bureaucratic and inefficient, which is accurate. He viewed them as creating logistical hurdles rather than facilitating his legion's campaigns. Again, accurate. His disdain for their red tape and political maneuvering led him to believe that he was better off solving problems independently. This is rough. He could have been great at reforming the Administratum to be worthwhile, but instead he just sort of threw them to the wayside and ignored them. That's rough. That's a missed opportunity right there. The administratum's focus on managing the vast complexities of the Imperium and kind of making a hash at it clashed with Perturabo's desire for efficiency and immediate results. This created an underlying tension in their interactions, where Perturabo wanted results and the administratum wanted paperwork. Perturabo did respect the Emperor. He knew just how powerful the Emperor was, or at least he thought he did. But he harbored a deep resentment toward the Emperor for what he perceived as a lack of acknowledgement for his accomplishments. Throughout the Great Crusade, he felt overburdened by thankless tasks, especially sieges and garrison duties, and he blamed the Emperor, ultimately, for his legion's assignments. Sometimes that's a fair blame, and other times not so much. He had this belief that the Emperor did not value his talents, and he viewed his legion's assignments as reinforcement of that belief. Like many of the Primarchs, Perturabo believed that the Emperor showed favoritism towards certain Primarchs, those whose legions were celebrated for glory, notably the Luna Wolves, later called the Sons of Horus. This is accurate. The Emperor did play favorites, and it meant that the legions who excelled in logistical and strategic work did not get the recognition that they deserved. This perceived slight deepened his bitterness and alienation from the wider imperial structure, which was ultimately descended from the authority of the emperor. Meanwhile, Perturabo's interactions with his brothers also reflected his broader disdain for imperial institutions. He respected many of the other Primarchs. He knew how competent they were, yes, but he felt overshadowed by the more celebrated Primarchs who were closer to the emperor, notably Horus, eventually the War Master, and Rogaldorn, the Praetorian. He saw them as symbols of the emperor's neglect of his own legion and his own contributions, leading to rivalry and animosity, particularly with Dorn, whose comparative praise and strategic role in fortification and defense stood in stark contrast to Perturabo's thankless siege work, a slow, grinding attack with little room for glory. Perturabo's attitude thus alienated him from Primarchs who might otherwise have been excellent for supporting him, notably Ferrus Manus or Vulcan, who also possessed technical genius, but who maintained healthier relationships with imperial institutions. Perturabo's distaste for imperial institutions and his concomitant disdain for those who interacted closely with them stemmed from his own unmet emotional needs for recognition, appreciation, and connection. This disdain reflected his inability to see the value in collaboration or the strengths of others, ultimately isolating him and exacerbating his bitterness. It shows us a tragic flaw, a self-imposed isolation, which ultimately leads to his downfall. We talked a little bit about how Perturabo felt the emperor perceived him and felt that he was not given enough attention. But how did the emperor and the custodes actually feel and actually think about Perturabo? From what I can tell from canon, the emperor and custodes' views on Perturabo were shaped by a mixture of recognition for his immense intellect and skill, but tempered by frustration with his personality and outlook. The emperor saw immense potential in Perturabo as a military commander, but his inability or unwillingness to address Perturabo's emotional needs or temper Perturabo's bitterness contributed to Perturabo's eventual fall. First and foremost, the emperor valued Perturabo's unparalleled mastery of siegecraft, engineering, and strategy. He saw the genius of himself manifested in Perturabo. Nobody could rival his ability to dismantle fortifications, plan campaigns, or execute vast, complex logistical operations. Dorn sometimes came close at his best, and he still did not measure up. Perturabo's efficiency and ruthlessness in completing thankless tasks, notably sieges and garrison duties, made him indispensable, but it went unacknowledged by both the emperor and the broader Imperium, in large parts because Perturabo didn't ask for acknowledgement. Perturabo's bitterness and arrogance may have frustrated the emperor, viewing these traits as signs of immaturity or an inability to see the larger picture. But there is also a less ideal option, that the emperor may have just not noticed and not thought about it. In general, the emperor hoped that responsibility as head of a legion would temper his son's emotional flaws and lead them to self-improvement, hoping that they would find fulfillment in service to the Imperium. This always proved to be a miscalculation, especially so with Perturabo. The emperor's nature blinded him to Perturabo's deep need for recognition and appreciation. He failed to address the growing resentment that festered within Perturabo, as he was tasked with the most grueling and unrewarding assignments, with his legion incurring heavy losses in lengthy siege campaigns and garrisoning unruly worlds in little tiny organizations, sometimes a squad of 10 for a hive world of billions. Despite Perturabo's flaws, the emperor trusted him with critical tasks because he knew that his brilliance and capability would ensure success. But this trust was not reciprocated by Perturabo, who felt undervalued and burdened with assignments he believed beneath his talents. And you know what? Honestly, that's understandable. The Custodes, never the biggest fans of the Primarchs, did have professional respect for Perturabo's skill. The Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, his eyes and ears, the most discerning evaluators of the Primarchs, not blinded by the incredible glory of their demigod appearance, still respected Perturabo's strategic brilliance and technical expertise. They understood that he was the Imperium's greatest asset in siegecraft and logistics, and the greatest strategic mind besides the Emperor. They knew his importance to the Emperor's plans, and they still didn't like him, which is fair, as with other volatile Primarchs like Angron and Kors. The Custodes harbored concerns about Perturabo's personality. They saw his bitterness and his isolation and his disdain for others, even if the Emperor didn't care. They understood that these traits made him difficult to advise or control or oversee, and thus the Custodes approached Perturabo with caution. The Custodes did not have any substantial influence on Perturabo. His pride and distrust of authority outside of the Emperor, trust is a strong word there. His inability to listen to authority outside of the Emperor, made him resistant to advice or oversight, even from the people that the Emperor trusted the most, the Custodes. Because of that, the Custodes did not advocate for Perturabo. It's hard to say from what we see in the Horus Heresy novels whether the Custodes recognized Perturabo's potential for rebellion, given his simmering resentment and hostility. I feel that, from the limited evidence we have in the text, that, like the Emperor, the Custodes underestimated how deeply Perturabo's feelings would drive him towards betrayal. Now, I suspect, though I can't prove it in the text, that the Custodes may have politically pushed for Perturabo to be sidelined in siege campaigns, as opposed to fighting in the heights of glory in the main theaters of the Great Crusade. I can't prove it, but it would explain a lot. The Emperor saw the Primarchs as tools for fighting and safeguarding the Imperium, but he failed to consider the emotional and psychological needs. The Custodes didn't care about those psychological needs. They just wanted to protect the Emperor from the Primarchs. Perturabo's case exemplifies this oversight on those two, because his brilliance was undermined by his bitterness and sense of neglect. This is what led him to turn against the Emperor later. Because of all this, it seems unlikely for a Custodes advisor to receive much respect from Perturabo. Doesn't matter how many compliments and how much validation the custodian would provide Perturabo. He would be an outsider, he would be a spy, he would not be welcomed. But perhaps a custodian serving as an observer may have been able to work as an emotional alarm bell to give the advance warning to the Emperor of Perturabo's growing resentment and unmet need for validation. Perturabo respected very few people, honestly mostly just the Emperor and Horus. His pride would have made him resistant to advice, especially from a custodian who he would rightly have seen as a spy, an outsider, or worse, a babysitter. His belief in his own intellectual superiority might have led him to dismiss the Custodes as merely highly skilled warriors, without the strategic acumen to understand the burdens of a Primarch, which is fair. They were not commanders, they were warriors, they were bodyguards for the Emperor. Perturabo would likely have seen the presence of a custodian as another sign that the Emperor lacked trust in him. When did the Emperor assign Custodes as observers? Well, when he didn't trust the Primarchs. He assigned custodians to observe Lorgar after Monarchia, for example. We'll get to that later. Thus, even the act of assigning a custodian might have deepened Perturabo's sense of alienation and resentment. Even if a custodian attempted to provide validation, Perturabo would have dismissed it, believing that only the Emperor's acknowledgement, or Horus's acknowledgement, had any real weight. And why would you accept validation and compliments from someone you view as your lesser? And still, it may have been useful. The custodian could have served as an emotional alarm bell, as I mentioned earlier. As an impartial observer, a custodian might have been well positioned to notice Perturabo's emotional turmoil and growing bitterness, particularly during moments of intense frustration or perceived slights against him from the broader military apparatus. And thus the Custodes would have been in good position to report these concerns directly to the Emperor, providing valuable insight into the emotional state of one of his most troubled sons, who he otherwise did not know about. By identifying patterns of resentment and self-isolation and bringing these to the Emperor's attention, the Custodes would have given the Emperor a chance to intervene earlier, potentially shifting Perturabo's legion's tasks to those that were more meaningful, greater opportunity for glory and recognition. Custodes advisors or observers might have highlighted the growing strain within the Iron Warriors, whose morale suffered under the thankless garrison duties assigned to them, which scattered them to the winds, and the horrible, grueling sieges which just ground them down into the dirt over the years. The Custodes' direct loyalty to the Emperor and direct pathway of communication to him would have lent their warnings substantial weight, making it more likely for the Emperor to take their concerns seriously. I mean, where else was the Emperor going to hear about Perturabo's problems? Imperial army commanders? Other Primarchs? Horus sure wasn't going to tell him. Perturabo sure wasn't going to tell the Emperor about his own problems. The Emperor's utilitarian approach to his sons suggest that he might have acknowledged the Custodes' warnings, but then refrained from taking meaningful action, viewing Perturabo's resentment as a personal failing rather than a critical issue requiring intervention. This would not have been the first or last time that the Emperor failed his sons. The Emperor generally believed in the inherent loyalty of the Primarchs. He may have underestimated how deeply Perturabo's resentment could drive him to rebellion. He might have assumed that Perturabo's brilliance and sense of duty would ultimately outweigh his bitterness towards the Emperor and the broader Imperium. Thus, even if the Custodes had identified the problem and conveyed the urgency of the situation to the Emperor might have taken steps to recognize Perturabo's contributions, adjust his legion's assignments, or provide him with support that could have alleviated his growing discontent. But none of that is guaranteed. This hypothetical idea of a custodian observer highlights the Emperor's tragic blind spot regarding his son's emotional needs. While a Custodes advisor or observer might have served as a valuable early warning system, the Emperor's consistent failure to address the emotional and psychological well-being of the Primarchs underscores the hubris of his vision. Perturabo's downfall, like that of many of his brothers, was a failure of understanding and compassion, not so much a failure of strategy and control. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors had limited, close mentorship or partnerships during the Great Crusade, largely due to Perturabo's reserved personality and partly due to the nature of the tasks they were assigned. Unlike some Primarchs who thrived in collaboration, Perturabo's aloofness and growing bitterness made it difficult for him to form meaningful bonds with his brothers or foster strong alliances between the Iron Warriors and other legions. Perturabo received little direct mentorship after the introduction to the Imperium, reflecting the Emperor's hands-off approach to many of his sons. But also, he probably would not have accepted mentorship from someone he would have seen as, at best, a lateral person, someone equal to him, and at worst, his lesser. Because of all this, Perturabo's technical and strategic brilliance meant that he was often left to solve problems on his own, reinforcing his belief that he was unappreciated and burdened with tasks others could not handle. Perturabo's relationships with his brothers were generally then marked with rivalry and resentment. He didn't respect them as his equals, and he sure didn't respect them as his superiors, which meant that he thought of them as his inferiors. His antagonistic relationship with Rogel Dorn over the comparative merits of their engineering skills is a great example here. It poisoned any chance of camaraderie between them. Meanwhile, Ferrus Manus and Vulcan, his equals in the Forge, excelling in technological and engineering disciplines, Perturabo had disdain for them. He had a sense of competition against them rather than partnership, but ultimately, no matter what wonders they wrought in the Forge, he always thought of himself as being better. The Iron Warriors were assigned to garrison and siege duties, isolating them from other legions in the more glorious battles of the Great Crusade. This in itself limited opportunities for meaningful cooperation with other legions and reinforced the Iron Warriors' perception that they were undervalued. There was no chance that, for example, the Space Wolves were going to dispatch a great company to fight alongside a bunch of Iron Warriors besieging some fortress world somewhere for possibly a decade. No, they were just going to go off and fight some aliens someplace, bring a few worlds into compliance, and receive accolade. Now, the Iron Warriors did occasionally fight alongside the Luna Wolves, later named the Sons of Horus, and Perturabo respected Horus as a strategist, but their relationship did not extend into deep personal camaraderie. Horus's charisma and ability to validate others appealed to Perturabo's need for recognition, possibly influencing Perturabo's eventual decision to side with Horus during the heresy. But Horus was also the one who tricked Perturabo into offering up his own legion for garrison duty, showing that Horus viewed Perturabo and the Iron Warriors as tools for him to use in his position as War Master, rather than allies to nurture and grow. Now, I'll say, the Iron Warriors shared a grim and methodical approach to warfare with the Word Bearers, strangely enough. Both legions felt unappreciated by the Emperor, and they may have found common ground in their bitterness after Monarchia. Perhaps this shared resentment may have fostered a pragmatic alliance, explaining why Lorgar was able to recruit Perturabo for the heresy. The Iron Warriors worked alongside other legions on occasion when there was some massive problem that needed the cooperation of multiple legions to deal with. We'll talk about the orcs and stuff later. But these collaborations were pragmatic rather than emotionally or ideologically driven, and they lasted only for like a campaign at a time. Perturabo's stoic and dismissive nature, coupled with the Iron Warriors' reputation as dour and merciless siege specialists, limited their ability to forge strong partnerships, sure, but it also meant that when they fought alongside other legions, those legions felt comfortable hogging all the credit for themselves and saying, yeah, the Iron Warriors were also there. The isolation of the Iron Warriors and Perturabo's inability to form close bonds with his brothers as allies mirrors the emotional gulf that defined Perturabo's character. This lack of mentorship or meaningful partnership highlights the systemic failures of the Emperor's approach to the Primarchs. Would Perturabo's fate have changed if he had developed a deeper bond with a more empathetic Primarch, basically any of them? Or was his downfall inevitable due to his own internal struggles and the nature of his assignments? By looking at these questions, you could make your own video to better explore and better understand the tragic arc of the Iron Warriors. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction. Did the Iron Warriors fail to receive recognition and validation primarily because they did not ask for it? I'll say the Iron Warriors' failure to receive recognition was not solely because they did not ask for it, but that was a contributing factor. Deeper reasons can be seen stemming from their role in the Imperium, the personality of Perturabo, and the overall dynamics of the Great Crusade and the Emperor's leadership style. The biggest problem, I feel, is that they didn't ask for it, their lack of self-advocacy and self-promotion. The Iron Warriors were stoic and practical, reflecting Perturabo's personality and what he demanded they be, iron within, iron without. They believed that their work should speak for itself rather than needing to be championed or celebrated, and they saw it as weakness to self-promote and ask for recognition. You do the job is bad, and then you don't complain about it. The problem is then that leads to you being assigned more bad jobs. Other legions, notably the Ultramarines and Luna Wolves, were led by charismatic Primarchs who were natural diplomats and self-promoters, gaining recognition for their achievements and for their legions. Perturabo maybe lacked this ability, but he definitely lacked the inclination, thus leaving the Iron Warriors undervalued by others. Their work was not glamorous. Their accomplishments were seen as necessary but unremarkable. This diminished their visibility and recognition. If they had self-promoted, they might have gotten some better assignments, and then that would feed into a cycle of you win some glorious victory, people say, hey, they win glorious victories, and you get more opportunities for such. Instead, the Iron Warriors were frequently assigned grueling, unending siege campaigns and split up into garrison duties, tasks which any other Primarch would have howled at, saying, no, what are you doing to my legion? These tasks were critical, but they didn't carry the glory of conquest or the prestige of exploration, so it left their efforts unappreciated. Many of their duties involved maintaining compliance on already conquered worlds, the aforementioned garrison duties. But this contrasted with legions like the Luna Wolves or the White Scars, who were at the forefront of expansion, receiving accolade for their conquests. The constant grind of siege warfare led to them to have high casualties and emotionally taxed them. This bred bitterness within the legion, compounded by the lack of celebration or acknowledgement for their sacrifices. Perturabo sure wasn't going to acknowledge what they were going through, and he told them it was weakness to ask for acknowledgement. So they sure weren't going to ask anyone else. Perturabo's uncompromising demeanor and treatment of people as numbers discouraged open communication about emotional needs, both within the Legion and between the Legion and the Imperium at large. His resentment of his brothers and his refusal to seek validation reinforced a feedback loop where the Iron Warriors were overlooked. Perturabo's own need for recognition clashed with his disdain for weakness, leading him to suppress his own desire for acknowledgement. And thus, we had an environment where neither he nor his legion could effectively advocate for themselves, and every other Primarch understood that because the Iron Warriors weren't advocating for themselves, they could effectively swamp the Iron Warriors with the bad jobs no one else wanted to do. They may not have said it outright, but everyone else understood the dynamic here. The Emperor's approach to leadership emphasized results over emotional well-being. He assigned tasks based on capability rather than considering their impact on morale. The Iron Warriors were tasked with roles that no other legion wanted, because they were well suited for them, and because they weren't going to complain like anyone else would. But this pigeonholed them into a position where their contributions were undervalued. The Emperor's failure to validate Perturabo's contributions personally exacerbated his sense of neglect, and thus drove a wedge between them. The Imperial Fists under Rogel Dorn sometimes performed similar tasks to the Iron Warriors, but received greater recognition. This was due to Dorn's close relationship with the Emperor as his Praetorian, and his own willingness to act as a spokesperson for his legion. The Luna Wolves and the Ultramarines were celebrated for their glorious victories, but the Iron Warriors were left with the the aftermath that lacked glory. Grammar's hard. Perturabo compared himself unfavorably to his brothers, seeing himself as being less valued than, say, Dorn, and this fueled his sense of rivalry with his brothers, thus further alienating him and his legion from others. And so the Iron Warriors' lack of recognition stemmed from a combination of their assignments, Perturabo's personality, and the Imperial military apparatus approach to war. I think that their failure to advocate themselves was the biggest part of all of this. But there was also a deeper systemic issue, that the Imperium's focus on results over morale left the Iron Warriors feeling used and unappreciated. Had Perturabo been more open to seeking validation, or had the Emperor recognized his contributions more directly, the trajectory of the Iron Warriors might thus have been different, but their bitterness and resentment were already deeply rooted in their role, and their leaders' unaddressed emotional needs sure didn't help. We've talked before about how, since the Emperor sure wasn't going to meet his son's emotional needs, maybe they could have met each other's emotional needs as brothers. Perturabo is maybe the hardest one for that. If another Primarch, such as Rogel Dorn, had recognized both the accomplishments of the Iron Warriors and their need for validation, and had wanted to laud their accomplishments and compliment them publicly, would he have been able to do so in a manner that the Iron Warriors would not have been insulted by? Rogel Dorn I picked specifically because his own stoic and duty-driven nature made him uniquely positioned to understand the Iron Warriors' challenges and achievements. But it would have been a delicate emotional task to validate the Iron Warriors and laud their accomplishments without it seeming like an insult to them. This would require a careful balance of sincerity, respect, and empathy, and Dorn was not good at any of those things. Now, the Iron Warriors, on their side of things, resisted praise for the same idea. They viewed it as weakness to want it, so they viewed it as weakness to accept it. They were suspicious of flattery. Perturabo made his legion highly cynical and highly pragmatic. This made them distrustful of praise, which they viewed as patronizing or manipulative. And sometimes it was, that's fair. But not always. The Iron Warriors were acutely aware of their rivalry with the Imperial Fists. Praise from Dorn specifically might have been interpreted as condescending, or as Dorn saying that they were secondary to the Imperial Fists. And by the time Perturabo's resentment had festered to the point that someone else not serving directly alongside the Iron Warriors might have noticed, the Iron Warriors were already entrenched in their sense of being undervalued. Their bitterness could make them resistant to accepting compliments at face value. For any validation to resonate, Dorn would have needed to approach the situation with authenticity and a deep understanding for their perspective, and he wasn't great at either authenticity or perspective. Okay, here's how he could have succeeded. Dorn could have emphasized the shared burden of fortification and siege warfare. Yes, the Imperial Fists had gained greater recognition and validation and glory and laud for doing similar things before. But they did still do similar things before. He could demonstrate that he understood and respected the sacrifices and challenges that went into siege warfare. By highlighting mutual respect between their legions as peers and expertise, maybe this would have reduced feelings of rivalry. Maybe. The Iron Warriors valued results. Dorn thus could have framed his praise in terms of the Iron Warriors' effectiveness, emphasizing the vital role their work played in securing the Imperium and the victories they achieved that maybe no one else could have. The Iron Warriors' mastery of siegecraft has saved countless lives and ensured victory where others would falter, that sort of thing. Dorn would need to focus on the Iron Warriors' accomplishments and avoid downplaying them to avoid inflaming personal rivalries. And any critique aimed at Perturabo specifically, even praise aimed at Perturabo specifically, might have been misconstrued by Perturabo as veiled insults as part of competition. Ultimately, rather than going to the Iron Warriors and praising them directly, Dorn, as a respected and somewhat politically powerful Primarch, could have used his influence to elevate the stature of the Iron Warriors, his nephews, in the eyes of the broader Imperium. Public acknowledgement of their contributions, such as during war council meetings or triumphs or big speeches, that sort of thing, might have thus soothed the Iron Warriors' feelings of neglect. We went through a hard campaign, but that guy we hate just said nice things about us from halfway across the galaxy, out of nowhere. Maybe people do recognize what we do. Ultimately, though, it might have been a good idea to offer to work alongside the Iron Warriors on key campaigns as a way to build camaraderie. Collaborative success can foster mutual respect. If Dorn or another Primarch had carefully delivered positive feedback, maybe such efforts might have validated the Iron Warriors without triggering their suspicion, thus alleviating some of their bitterness and fostering greater cooperation between the Iron Warriors and other legions. But any misstep, any perceived condescension, anything that Perturabo views as focus on his own shortcomings, any perceived lack of authenticity, would deepen the Iron Warriors' resentment. Maybe a more emotionally attuned Primarch, that is, just about any of them, might have had an easier time connecting with Perturabo and his legion rather than Dorn. It's just that Dorn's experience with siege campaigns would mean that he might have been able to understand the emotional core of their frustrations. Dorn's stoicism might have made him relatable, but also he lacked the warmth necessary to truly soothe the Iron Warrior's wounded pride. Dorn had the capacity to validate the Iron Warriors in a way that maybe even Horus didn't, but his success would have depended on a highly nuanced approach that he was not well suited for. As we saw with Conrad Kurz, Dorn tended to fly off of the handle when approached with new emotional situations. The Iron Warriors' existing bitterness and Perturabo's pride created significant barriers to meaningful reconciliation between them. It would have taken a carefully executed strategy, emphasizing shared purpose, public acknowledgement, and sincere respect to be able to begin to bridge the divide and begin to alter the trajectory of the Iron Warriors. But, thankfully, strategy was something that Dorn was great at. Back when we talked about the Salamanders, we talked a little bit about the possibility of the Salamanders helping to meet the emotional needs of the Iron Warriors on a small level, like an individual garrison. Maybe if a top-down approach might falter due to Perturabo's bitterness and arrogance, maybe a bottom-up approach may have had more success. If the Iron Warriors had served more closely beside other legions, then they might have found a sense of community and validation that they sure weren't getting from their father. Maybe this might have alleviated their growing resentment. If other legions had undertaken the shared sacrifice of serving closely with the Iron Warriors on the distasteful siege campaigns and garrison duties, then maybe this would have fostered mutual respect through shared hardship. Witnessing the admiration and gratitude of fellow Astartes when the Iron Warriors succeeded and achieved might have helped the Iron Warriors to feel more valued. And plus, there could have been the opportunity for cultural cross-pollination, prolonged interaction with a legion with a different emotional culture might have introduced the Iron Warriors to alternative ways of approaching their duties and relationships, thus challenging their insular mindset. The Iron Warriors were generally left to handle grueling siege duties and isolated garrison duties alone, reinforcing their feelings of neglect. Pairing them with other legions might have decreased their sense of isolation and highlighted their vital contributions to larger imperial efforts. While Perturabo might bristle at public praise. Individual squads or companies of Iron Warriors serving alongside forces from other legions might have resulted in them receiving direct recognition for their efforts, boosting morale on a smaller personal scale. And exposure to other Primarchs or leaders from other legions might have provided alternative examples of leadership and purpose which could resonate with the rank and file Iron Warriors. There's any number of good options there. Not the World Eaters. There's a few bad options, but anything from the Blood Angels or Salamanders or Ultramarines, maybe the Word Bearers, the Space Wolves. They had this whole brotherly thing going on. Even the Emperor's Children would have been a good option. Let's take a look at some options. The Salamanders. The Salamanders were known for their empathy and their care for civilians. The Salamanders might have modeled a more humane perspective on duty. Their focus on protecting lives might have inspired the Iron Warriors to see their own efforts in a more positive, constructive light. Not just, we're here to bring down that wall over the course of 10 years, but instead, we're here to save millions of lives by doing this. Maybe the Ultramarines. They were masters of diplomacy and efficient logisticians. There we go. Words are hard. Maybe the Ultramarines might have taught the Iron Warriors the value of collaboration. They were professional. They were structured. They appreciated strategy. These are things that the Ultramarines would have been able to recognize also in the Iron Warriors. The Ultramarines might have thus been able to dispel the bitterness of whichever company they were fighting alongside by emphasizing the importance of both of them in the larger Imperial machine. Now, the Ultramarines were quite vainglorious and self-aggrandizing sometimes, viewing themselves as better than everyone. So it's conceivable that they might have thus competed with the Iron Warriors for glory, instead of promoting an idea of shared accomplishment. As their natural rivals, the Imperial Fists might have provided a lens through which the Iron Warriors could see their own worth more clearly. Maybe joint operations could have fostered grudging respect and possibly eased some of the rivalry between them, if facilitated carefully. But there's the risk there that familiarity breeds contempt. Overall, there's the challenge of entrenched resentment. The Iron Warriors' bitterness might have led them to view other legions they fought alongside as competitors, especially if those legions received more public acclaim, as happened several times when the Iron Warriors fought alongside other legions. There was the possibility of culture clash, with the Iron Warriors' pragmatic, grim, disdainful of weakness outlook. That might have clashed with the idealism of some other legions, leading to friction instead of unity. Now, this might have been more of a problem with some legions, like the Word Bearers, than with others, like the Dark Angels. It's hard to say. And then, of course, there's Perturabo. If Perturabo perceived all of this as an attempt to undermine his authority, he might sabotage such efforts, removing his own soldiers from theaters with other legions. If the Iron Warriors had fought alongside other legions that they viewed as politically favored, this also could have exacerbated their sense of inferiority, their thought that they were not treated as equals by the broader Imperium, rather than alleviating these concerns. But shit, man, what else are you gonna do? Nothing? Like the Emperor did through the whole Great Crusade? You gotta try something. Maybe over time, exposure to different perspectives and recognition from their peers might have tempered the Iron Warriors' bitterness, fostering a greater sense of belonging within the Imperium. Now, while individual squads or companies of Iron Warriors might benefit, it would take a lot for the overall culture of the Legion to change. they would be likely to be resistant to change without Perturabo's active support, like how Sanguinius made sure to actively change the culture of his legion when he took command of them. Ultimately, if mishandled, efforts could have deepened the problems of the Iron Warriors, deepening their resentment and alienation and accelerating their eventual fall. But you gotta try something. If you just say, oh, wow, yeah, there's a problem with Perturabo and the Iron Warriors, I sure hope it fixes itself, then it won't get fixed. I feel that a bottom-up approach, integrating the Iron Warriors with other legions, offers a better alternative to a purely top-down strategy. This approach would not be without risks, but it might have been able to address their unmet emotional needs through genuine camaraderie and localized recognition. By focusing on rank-and-file Astartes, maybe the Imperium might have provided the Iron Warriors with the sense of validation and community that Perturabo could not or would not offer. Let us now examine the period of Perturabo's early interstellar leadership, from taking command of his legion and immediately ordering decimation, up until their involvement in the Olympian Rebellion. Thank goodness, there's a lot of canonical evidence to back up what I'm about to say. This is rare for the Primarchs. This period highlights the interplay between his brilliance, ruthlessness, and emotional isolation, as well as the changing dynamics between him and the Iron Warriors Legion itself, as they navigated the demands of the Great Crusade. Alright, so first off, when Perturabo assumed command of the Iron Warriors, he inherited a legion with high casualties and a tarnished reputation, partly due to the siege warfare they were already being used for. His immediate decision was to enact decimation, a punishment in which 1/10 of the legion chosen at random were executed by their comrades, was both shocking and telling. It places him far away from every one of the other Primarchs. Perturabo's insistence on absolute discipline and efficiency and perfectionism, even at great cost, demonstrated his obsession with control. He could have said, "We're going to much improve now that I'm here." Instead, he said, "You're not good enough," and punished them. This reflects his inability to connect emotionally with others, treating his legion as a tool rather than as his sons. We can see this as the cycle of abuse. This is how he felt treated by his father, so this is now how he's going to treat his Marines. The decimation immediately alienated him from his legion, creating an atmosphere of fear rather than loyalty and respect. This set a precedent for the strained relationship between Perturabo and his warriors, meaning that neither of them could count on the other to meet each other's emotional needs, in the way that 16 other legions could, where Primarchs like Guilliman or Sanguinius sought to inspire and elevate their legions and lead by example. Perturabo ruled through fear and punishment, putting him in the company of Conrad Kurs and the Night Lords. Though I don't believe in canon he ever specifically acknowledges the similarities between their leadership styles. Under Perturabo, the Iron Warriors cemented their reputation as the masters of siege warfare, and at the same time, as being the legion which would not complain when given the task of siege warfare. His tactical genius allowed them to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, but his single-minded focus on efficiency generally disregarded the well-being of his warriors, much less the well-being or even survival of any Imperial army elements assigned to fight alongside him. Perturabo's brilliance in siegecraft and in the logistics of warfare brought decisive victories where perhaps no other Primarch could have. In the Great Crusade, the first and greatest of these victories was, of course, against the Black Judges. His ability to analyze and dismantle enemy defenses to bring exactly the right tool to the right location at the right time made the Iron Warriors indispensable during the Great Crusade. But the relentless nature of siege warfare took a heavy toll on the morale and the physical well-being of both Perturabo and the Iron Warriors Legion. His lack of concern for the human cost deepened the Iron Warriors' resentment, as they felt like tools rather than valued warriors. This makes sense, as their father Perturabo was himself a massive tool. Perturabo's abrasive personality and disdain for other imperial institutions created friction with other legions and other imperial forces. His growing bitterness towards perceived favoritism, particularly towards the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, began to fester during the Great Crusade. Interestingly, Horus, though obviously the Emperor's favorite, had enough political acumen that he could maintain a good relationship with Perturabo, even while treating the Iron Warriors poorly. So we talked earlier about the Black Judges. Let's get into that. The Black Judges of the Meritara cluster, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, were a powerful group of, let's call them transhumans, who used hideous vampiric archaeotech from the Dark Age of technology along with augmetics to become immortal transhumans. We can see some similarity between their technology and the Halo devices described in, for example, Dark Heresy or the Rogue Trader RPG, which prolong life by giving up one's humanity. The Black Judges used nearby worlds as farms, providing protection from Xenos in exchange for live humans that they could use to prolong their own lives. Their fleet raided like a dozen worlds for captives regularly. We can see them roughly as being a human analog to how the Drukhari operate. Perturabo made the Black Judges his first target upon taking leadership of the Iron Warriors, because his homeworld of Olympia had once been raided by the Black Judges. If I understand it right from canon, this was long before Perturabo was alive, but still, perhaps Perturabo was motivated by revenge. Perhaps he felt that his pride was wounded by this historical entity. Maybe he intended for this to prove his strength to his home world. Or maybe he saw the potential to use the technological secrets of the Black Judges to trade with the Mechanica to gain advantage. By achieving great victory against the Black Judges, killing all of them, and bringing their home base back to Olympia to serve as an orbital dockyard, Perturabo learned that there were great rewards to be won by pursuing vengeance against someone he felt had wronged him. This was a lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life and into his daemonhood. The Mashog campaign. The Ulanor campaign was a defining moment for the Imperium, defeating the most powerful contemporary Orc empire and culminating in the triumph of the Luna Wolves and Horus Lupercal's promotion to War Master. But earlier, the Iron Warriors had been instrumental in defeating the Orc war boss Oversog Mashog. I don't give a shit if I'm pronouncing that right. They're orcs. When the Space Wolves and White Scars were failing to make any headway in the campaign. And in return for saving their asses, Perturabo received almost no credit. He was then pointedly not asked to play a key supporting role in the Ulanor campaign, despite his obvious suitability for that war, thus underscoring his growing discontent. Now, please note that in some older canon, the Mashog and Ulanor campaigns are smushed together a bit because the events of the Great Crusade had not been fully fleshed out. For our purposes, they are separate events. Do not leave a comment about this. I don't care. The Iron Warrior's siegecraft was instrumental in dismantling Orc fortifications when fighting Mashog, paving the way for the Space Wolves to deliver the killing blow. Despite their contributions, The Iron Warriors received little recognition compared to the unabashedly self-promoting Space Wolves, fueling their feelings of neglect and perceived inferiority in the eyes of the wider Imperium. All right, next, the planets of the Vopla Straits, Saktrata Deeps, and Golgis, I hope I'm pronouncing those right, were infested by the alien Hrud, sometimes called the Bendies. Look up the book Xenology for details if you want more information about them. They're quite interesting. Anyway, the War Council ordered an invasion, even though the area was of negligible strategic value. Since everyone knew that fighting the Hrud was going to be a bad campaign, it ended up being assigned to the Iron Warriors. This habit of the Imperial war machine, the bureaucracy dumping trash on Perturabo, was a pain in the rear, and it led to resentment of both the War Council and the Emperor. Anyone with siblings can tell you parents must not play favorites, because otherwise it leads to problems. The alien time-based weaponry of the Hrud was horribly effective against the Iron Warriors at the Saktrata Deeps and at the coterminous Golgis campaign, inflicting terrible losses, and the Iron Warriors achieved only limited success. A great many Hrud escaped Saktrata, so Perturabo could not point to it as a great moral victory like Fulgrim did against the Lair. The warsmith in command at Golgis was forced to flee the planet and afterwards openly question the value of the campaign against the Hrud in front of Perturabo. The Iron Warriors had an ethos of being too strong to complain, so Perturabo demoted him as punishment, even though he agreed that the campaign had been a bad idea. The problem here that we can see very clearly was that they saw any attempts to advocate them for themselves as weakness. This meant that they relied on the Emperor and the War Council and Horus and stuff to notice when things were unfair, because they sure weren't going to speak up for themselves. But the Emperor definitely did not stick up for Perturabo in this way. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now, the impact on Perturabo from these great moments in the Great Crusade. Victory over the Black Judges cemented his self-image of strength and strategic superiority and taught him that vengeance was good. The Mashog campaign reinforced Perturabo's perception that his legion's sacrifices were undervalued. His resentment towards, well, everybody, solidified, as he viewed them as recipients of undue praise and favoritism. So the Space Wolves say about themselves, we're great, and the Iron Warriors say nothing about themselves, and then people say to the Space Wolves, you're great. The thankless trudgery of war against the vile Hrud encouraged Perturabo's bitter nature. He grew upset at the Emperor specifically, despite the invasion orders coming from the subordinate War Council. I don't know how much we should care about the exact navigation of the orders. The Emperor was ultimately in charge. He could have stepped in and said, wow, guys, that's unfair. Perturabo's early leadership thus foreshadowed many of the dynamics that would later lead to his betrayal during the Horus Heresy. His genius went unrecognized. His legion's sacrifices were taken for granted both by himself and the Emperor. His resentment of Rogel Dorn and other favored Primarchs took root, and his leadership style, which we'll describe as unique, alienated him from his own legion, making sure that the culture of bitterness and discontent took root in them as well as in him. Guilliman's early leadership, for contrast, emphasized diplomacy and fostering loyalty among his warriors and allies by building institutions, contrasting sharply with the reliance of, say, Perturabo and Conrad Kurz on fear and punishment. The Ultramarines focus on building lasting institutions, and their freedom to do so, given the relatively wide latitude they were given in choosing their own campaigns, offered a stark counterpoint to the Iron Warriors' grueling and thankless campaigns thrust upon him. Russ's leadership was rooted in a strong sense of loyalty, family, and camaraderie with his warriors. The Space Wolves' emphasis on honor and kinship highlighted Perturabo's failure to forge a meaningful bond with his own legion, and the Space Wolves being willing, even eager, to self-promote after a great victory, singing about it in sagas for anyone who will listen, was the counterpoint to the Iron Warriors' unwillingness to ask for credit to be given or ask for burdens to be lifted. Thus, we can see Perturabo's early leadership was marked by tactical and strategic brilliance, doing things no one else could have, but also by emotional isolation, a lack of empathy, and a lack of outside support. His treatment of the Iron Warriors set the stage for the resentment and bitterness that would define their role in the Horus Heresy, mirroring his own. And by examining this period, we gain a deeper understanding of both Perturabo and the Iron Warriors' eventual betrayal and the cultural dynamics therein. We should take a moment to look at the internal legion politics of the Iron Warriors. They were somewhat complex and fraught with tension, shaped by their grueling role in the Great Crusade both before and after Perturabo found them, as well as Perturabo's leadership style and the Legion's culture of discipline, efficiency, and bitterness which he ingrained in them. Looking at these dynamics helps to explain somewhat the Legion's eventual fall to chaos and its enduring internal strife. Perturabo's decision to decimate the Legion upon taking command is the foundation of their culture. It made an immediate culture of fear and resentment that lingered throughout the Legion and continues to do so throughout 40K. The Iron Warriors lived under constant pressure to perform flawlessly because failure brought brutal punishment. Thus, the decimation destroyed morale and trust and replaced camaraderie with suspicion and survivalism. Perturabo's leadership style was authority, not so much respect. It alienated many within the Legion. He was feared but not loved. A contrast to 15 other Primarchs who inspired loyalty and admiration. Yeah, not Angron, not Comrade Kurs. Yeah, 15 others. This lack of personal connection to their Primarch thus fostered disillusionment among the rank-and-file Iron Warriors. They had no particular loyalty to Perturabo, and loyalty to the Emperor would have only gone through the middleman of Perturabo. Thus, there was no institutional loyalty to the Emperor. It was every man's decisions for himself. Now, there was some division between the Terran origin and Olympia origin Marines. The early Terran recruits, with their origins in the techno-barbarian culture of Old Earth, were shaped by their survivalist ethos and loyalty to the Emperor's vision, whereas the Olympian recruits were somewhat more influenced by Perturabo's own worldview, including his disdain for humanity's flaws and his perfectionist tendencies. These cultural differences created friction, as the Olympians generally viewed the Terrans as outdated relics, while the Terrans resented the Olympians' favoritism, which we can see a little bit of in canon. Over time, as Olympians became the majority, because the Iron Warriors had a somewhat high casualty rate, their worldview and culture dominated the Legion, further alienating the Terran origin Marines and deepening internal divisions. Now, there was some favoritism towards the Olympian origin Marines, but generally, the Iron Warriors were a meritocracy, but with brutal standards of promotion. based on ruthless efficiency and battlefield results. This meritocracy thus rewarded ambition but fostered a culture of paranoia and some amount of backstabbing. Officers rose by outmaneuvering or discrediting their peers, as much as through actual merit and achievement, thus creating a toxic environment of mistrust. And unlike legions like the Space Wolves or Salamanders, where bonds of brotherhood were strong, the Iron Warriors valued results over relationships. This lack of emotional connection, sometimes even within a squad, exacerbated the Legion's internal strife. A big part of the Iron Warriors' internal Legion dynamics was its relationship towards other outside Imperial institutions. They resented the Imperial Fists for their perceived favoritism and their public glory. They felt overburdened with siege duties, with the high concomitant casualties, and little recognition they gained. And this made for them an insular mentality, an us versus them mentality, without really much of an us. They believed that they were the unappreciated backbone of the Great Crusade, while others reaped the rewards, which was in many cases true. But their lack of brotherhood meant that each individual Iron Warrior felt in his heart of hearts that he personally was the unappreciated backbone of the Great Crusade, that all these other assholes were leaning on. Thus, Perturabo's bitterness towards the Emperor for failing to recognize his brilliance trickled down to his own legion through the culture he instilled within them. Many Iron Warriors began to question their role in the Imperium, especially during the Hrud campaign, seeing themselves as expendable tools rather than honored warriors. They saw the Imperial army that fought underneath their leadership as expendable tools. They felt that they were better than that, and when they felt like they were being treated that badly by others, it felt unfair to them. The Legion's culture of discontent thus made them susceptible to chaos. The promise of power, recognition, and liberation from their thankless existence was deeply appealing to Perturabo when he was offered that by Lorgar, and it was deeply appealing to many Iron Warriors individually. Thus, like we've been leading up to, there are some similarities to the Night Lords. Both legions shared a nihilistic worldview, a lack of camaraderie, and leadership through fear and punishment rather than respect or love, thus making a toxic internal culture. We'll talk more about the Ultramarines much later, but their focus on unity, loyalty, and honor were a wild contrast to the Iron Warriors' fractured and bitter culture. And in contrast with the Imperial Fists, while both legions specialized in siege warfare, the Imperial Fists' pride in their duty contrasted sharply with the Iron Warriors' resentment of theirs. Some of that's fair. The Iron Warriors were given worse assignments sometimes, but some of that's not fair. Thus, the Iron Warriors' internal politics reflect the darker aspects of the human condition, the corrosive effects of bitterness, the destructive power of perfectionism, and the isolating nature of mistrust. These elements thus made the Legion a tragic mirror of their own Primarch, highlighting the cost of unmet emotional needs and unaddressed grievances. Their eventual fall to chaos was the culmination of their own internal dysfunction. It wasn't so much external corruption put upon them, it was rather a life ring that they were grabbing onto because they felt like they were drowning. What characteristics of Perturabo could have helped him to stay loyal? What sources of strength could have been drawn upon to help the Iron Warriors remain loyal regardless of whether Perturabo fell? On the other hand, What fault lines could have drawn Perturabo and the Iron Warriors to fall to a specific chaos power? Perturabo was strong. He had excellent sources of strength, which he could have had drawn upon to help him stay loyal. Sentence structure got away from me a little there. He was brilliant. Perturabo's brilliance as a strategist and engineer could have provided him with the clarity to see chaos as a destructive and unreliable force. His pragmatism might have thus led him to recognize that aligning with chaos was ultimately self-defeating. And so we can see how the decision to align with Horus was an emotional one. Despite his bitterness, Perturabo had an ingrained sense of duty, evident in his tireless work on behalf of the Imperium. If he could have reconciled his duty to the Emperor with a sense of personal validation, this sense of responsibility might have kept him loyal. Perturabo's drive for perfection and achievement could have been a source of pride and loyalty if properly channeled. If the Emperor or other loyalists had acknowledged his contributions more effectively, Perturabo might have found satisfaction in his work and stayed true. Perturabo's bitterness stemmed largely from unmet emotional needs rather than an inherent affinity for chaos. A strong, affirming relationship, whether with the Emperor or whatever, might have given him the grounding he needed. Now, of course, that's a double-edged sword. If he'd had a strong, affirming relationship with Horus, like Mortarion did with Horus, then that would have been a source for Horus to call upon to try to pull him into treason. The Iron Warriors, meanwhile, had their own sources of strength, independent of Perturabo. They had a sense of brotherhood among themselves if they'd had greater exposure to other loyalist legions, greater integration, fighting alongside them. Perhaps that could have helped foster camaraderie and shared purpose. Positive relationships with other legions might have counteracted their isolation and resentment. Public recognition of their sacrifices and accomplishments, especially by authority figures like the Emperor or Horus, might have provided the recognition and validation they craved, and certainly were never going to ask for. Honors, triumphs, or ceremonial celebrations of their victories might have made a significant difference. If strong, empathetic leaders had risen within the Iron Warriors to greater prominence to provide a counterbalance to Perturabo's bitterness, perhaps they might have inspired loyalty to the Imperium in a portion of the Iron Warriors, regardless of Perturabo's decisions. An internal culture emphasizing honor in duty rather than resentment might have been transformative. Now, there were loyalist, somewhat high-ranking Iron Warriors. We see that in some of the Horus Heresy novels, but there could always be more. Now, if the Emperor or the Custodes had provided more consistent mentorship, then perhaps the Mentor Legion might have served as a guiding hand for the Iron Warriors' loyalty. Guidance from other Primarchs might have been able to fill some emotional gaps. Now, they, of course, had fault lines which did indeed lead them to fall to chaos. Perturabo's deep-seated resentment toward the Emperor for his perceived neglect, and some real neglect, made him susceptible to chaos. Chaos thus exploited that bitterness by promising power, recognition, and revenge. The Iron Warriors' Legion's insular culture and mistrust of other Imperial institutions, combined with their sense of being unappreciated, made them prone to seeking validation elsewhere. Chaos could thus frame itself as the only entity that truly valued their contributions. Perturabo's obsession with perfection, and his inability to tolerate imperfection, made him vulnerable to the lure of chaos. It's hard to say whether that could have pushed him towards any particular chaos god, but the Iron Warrior's stoicism in the face of suffering, while it was a strength, also made them a target for chaos. Perhaps Nurgle could have exploited their capacity to endure hardship by promising relief and purpose in their endless suffering. We can see some similarity there between the Iron Warriors and the Death Guard. The Legion's brutal methods and desensitization to human suffering might have led them to align with Khorne's ethos of bloodshed and destruction. Their frustration inherent in their role as the Imperium's siege masters could certainly have spiraled into the mindless rage that defines Khorne's followers. The Iron Warriors' resentment for being treated as tools rather than honored warriors made a crisis of identity. Perhaps Slaanesh might have exploited this, offering them a chance to revel in personal gratification instead of their thankless duty. This seems less likely, but whatever. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors illustrate how unmet emotional needs, isolation, and unaddressed grievances can create fertile ground for corruption. Conversely, their story also suggests that loyalty can be nurtured through recognition, connection, and shared purpose, which they didn't have. These themes resonate on a human level, emphasizing the power of validation and the dangers of neglect, both in the 40K universe and in the real world. What were the emotional needs of Perturabo during his period of early interstellar leadership? I feel that he was mostly defined at this time by his intense desire for recognition, appreciation, and understanding. These needs stemmed from his upbringing on Olympia, where his father provided none of those things, his intrinsic personality, and the role that he was expected to play within the Great Crusade. Perturabo was a prodigious architect, engineer, and strategist. During his early leadership, he craved acknowledgement of his brilliance, not just for his military successes, but for his ability to create, innovate, and envision a future. But his talents went unappreciated, as his legion was frequently assigned grueling, thankless siege warfare campaigns rather than glorious victories to be celebrated, and the Adeptus Mechanicus was politically involved in suppressing any interest in innovation. As a naturally introverted and analytical individual, Perturabo struggled to connect emotionally with others, including his legion and his brothers. Despite this, he desired to be understood and valued by those around him. Perturabo's lack of charisma, combined with the Imperial Fists being lauded as paragons of defense, a role which Perturabo also excelled in but was rarely praised for, exacerbated his feelings of alienation. Perturabo had a strong sense of fairness, born from the unfairness of his upbringing on Olympia, which made the perceived favoritism shown to his brothers, particularly Dorn, the Praetorian, deeply frustrating to him. The constant demands placed upon him and his legion with little respite or reward reinforced his belief that he and his sons were being treated unjustly. I can't go back to this enough. Perturabo was not just a destroyer. He yearned for creation. He wanted his creations, cities, fortresses, even sometimes works of art, interesting things that he would create in the Forge, to be admired. The endless cycle of destruction he was forced to endure clashed with this soul-deep desire. As a result of having his emotional needs not met, he had resentment and cynicism. The lack of recognition, the constant pressure, just made him grow more and more bitter through the Great Crusade. His resentment was directed at the Emperor, his brothers, and even his own legion for failing to meet his standards and failing to understand his struggles. His inability to form deep emotional connections left him feeling isolated, reinforcing his sense of being an outsider among the Primarchs. And then, as a defensive mechanism, he pushed them away further to try to tell himself that that's what he wanted. Perturabo's need for validation pushed him to extremes in seeking perfection both in his own works and in his legion. His sons bore the brunt of his frustration, leading to a strained relationship and a lack of mutual trust or affection. Thankfully, there are things that could have helped Perturabo, like genuine recognition, consistent and meaningful acknowledgement of his contributions, not just his military contributions, but also his engineering works, might have eased his bitterness. Public praise from the Emperor or Horus, or a role highlighting his talents, could have given him a sense of purpose beyond the worst parts of war. Assigning him to roles focused on creation, such as designing and building parts of the Imperial Palace maybe, could have aligned with his emotional needs. A stronger bond with one or more of his brother Primarchs might have mitigated his feelings of isolation, though his abrasive personality and the competitive nature of how he saw his role made that difficult. His emotional needs generally revolved around connections with other people and the lack thereof, recognition, respect, interpersonal connection. The complete lack of any of that laid the groundwork for his bitterness and his fall. His vast talents were never fully appreciated or nurtured by the Emperor, and Horus only saw what he could get Perturabo to do for him. How might Perturabo have contributed to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance? I feel this is one of the best options for a non-military role for the Primarchs. He was brilliant. He was deeply analytical, and he was so unhappy with his military role. He could have contributed significantly to the Imperium's governance, particularly in areas requiring logistical precision, planning, and infrastructure development. There's so much overlap with his skill set there. While his personality and bitterness might have made him less suited for roles requiring empathy or diplomacy, his nearly unparalleled technological expertise and focus on efficiency might have made him a valuable asset to the Imperium's stability and growth. About infrastructure and urban planning, the Imperium had so many hive cities, and they were terrible places to live. Perturabo's talent for engineering and fortifications could have, and logistics for that matter, could have thus transferred directly over to designing cities, transportation systems, and planetary infrastructure. He could have ensured that imperial worlds were built to be defensible, sustainable, and efficient, with minimized resource waste and maximized utility. Perturabo had some parts of the Imperium which aligned well with the way that he thought and worked. The STC systems, known to the Mechanicum, would have aligned greatly with his ideas of organization. He would have made modular, standardized city designs to streamline construction and maintenance. He would have made fortified hubs of commerce and governance to protect key assets from invasion or rebellion. But his focus on efficiency might have led to harsh utilitarian designs. Think like Soviet brutalism, prioritizing function over livability. He might have done well then, paired with someone with more of an eye for the emotional needs of a population. Honestly, Fulgrim wouldn't have been a bad choice. Perturabo's meticulous nature and mastery of logistics could have revolutionized the Imperium's supply chains, ensuring that resources and personnel were allocated efficiently across the galaxy. The Adeptus Administratum, notably inefficient, needed a lot of work to help improve them. His demonstrated ability to manage vast, complex systems would have been wonderful in supporting the Imperium's war efforts, but also its just domestic economy, optimizing the flow of materials and personnel between Forge Worlds, Hive Cities, agri-worlds, and battlefronts would have been excellent. Establishing redundancies and fail-safes to prevent disruptions from warp storms or enemy action would have meant that when an agri-world is beset by invasion, that didn't immediately lead to starvation in the next hive world over, you know? There wasn't any sort of resilience in the design of the Imperium's economy. Perturabo's perfectionism might have caused friction with the administratum, which was less efficient than he would have put up with. His frustration with the bureaucracy and their incompetence would likely have led to an authoritarian leadership style within the administratum, well, over the administratum. And honestly, that's what they needed to make them have any sort of reform. Perturabo's expertise in fortification would have been excellent in designing planetary defenses and system-wide defenses, ensuring that star systems would be better able to withstand invasion or prolonged siege. His strategic foresight could have allowed him to anticipate and prepare for threats that the Imperium hadn't even thought of yet, strengthening the Imperium's overall resilience. This would be more of a military-style civilian role, of course, so we can see exactly what he would do. He'd just take everything that he learned with the Iron Warriors and apply that to civilian planetary defense networks and spaceports and stuff. His designs emphasizing security might have made daily life a little more difficult for the trade side of things, having to navigate strict security procedures, but may have also been able to make worlds less vulnerable to, say, gene stealer infiltration, but whatever. Perturabo's methodical approach could have been applied to creating standardized procedures and codes for the Imperium's governance and administration. He might have introduced universal guidelines for urban planning, defense, and resource allocation, reducing inefficiencies across the galaxy. The Imperium doesn't have like one culture. It has millions of worlds, each of whom have multiple cultures. Perhaps he might have written manuals for planetary governments to implement on their worlds for their world's governance, ensuring consistency and cohesion, the way that Guilliman did for the Astartes chapters with the Codex Astartes. He might have thus been able to create scalable solutions for the challenges faced by planets of varying sizes and various types of resources. Though Perturabo was sometimes inflexible, maybe that would have made it difficult for local authorities to adapt his designs to unique planetary circumstances or local cultures, thus leading to resentment. Perturabo's engineering expertise might have been instrumental in surveying new worlds for colonization and designing terraforming systems to make them habitable. His ability to work with long-term thinking might have ensured that these projects would be sustainable. He might have established criteria for selecting planets suitable for colonization and maximizing their productivity. He might have designed infrastructure for early settlements, including resource extraction facilities, transportation networks, and defensive systems. Though he tended to be a perfectionist, perhaps that might have slowed colonization efforts. Hard to say. Guilliman excelled in governance and long-term strategy, focusing on societal development and stability. Perturabo, meanwhile, was more of a technocrat. He would have approached governance through a lens of engineering and logistics, focusing on infrastructure and efficiency. We talked about Fulgrim earlier. His contributions to governance might have focused on cultural enrichment and education. I feel that Perturabo would have been more practical and technical, prioritizing crude functionality over refined aesthetics. We'll talk about Dorn later. Dorn's approach was more or less greater for inspiring others and fostering loyalty, whereas Perturabo was more methodical and impersonal, reflecting his disdain for sentimentality. Now, Perturabo had some authoritarian tendencies. His frustration with inefficiency and incompetence might have led him to adopt rather harsh policies and leadership, alienating those under his rule. Perturabo's pragmatic approach to governance might have ignored the emotional and cultural needs of the population, creating dissatisfaction and unrest. Perturabo's sense of being underappreciated as a military leader might have thus colored his interactions with other imperial leaders, leading to friction and a lack of cooperation. Now, how might Perturabo have been helped to feel the admiration, appreciation, and support that he craved if he were in a civilian role rather than a military role? We talked about this need for validation and recognition already, and it seems like it would be easy for him to feel like leading the Adeptus Administratum, for example, that to feel that it was just as much of a thankless and terrible duty as were the grueling siege campaigns assigned to his legion during the Great Crusade. That is to say, his bitterness during the Great Crusade stemmed from feeling relegated to thankless tasks while other Primarchs had the opportunity to receive glory. If these patterns repeated in a civilian context, he would likely have fallen into the same pattern of despair and resentment. So, just like in his military role, Perturabo would need his emotional wounds to be addressed. The Emperor would need to ensure that his work was recognized and tied to a sense of purpose. And this is not an impossible task for the demigod Emperor, you know? Perturabo craved acknowledgement of his incredible intellect and labor, public recognition of his contributions, whether it be to the Imperium's infrastructure or logistics and administration, would validate his efforts and demonstrate how important he was to the Emperor and to the Imperium. The Emperor could have praised his civilian efforts in public forums, highlighting how his contributions sustained the Imperium's vast machinery, could have given him titles and accolades that highlight his genius. Perturabo was like the Emperor's Praetorian or whatever. Perturabo could have been the master architect of the Imperium. Public ceremonies, official celebrations, and honors for significant achievements, such as completing monumental infrastructure projects, or fortifying or completing the fortification of a key world, or putting in place the terraforming machinery for a new world, would show appreciation for Perturabo's leadership and ensure that his legacy was celebrated. Maybe name a city after him or something. You got to do something to immortalize his achievements. Maybe include Perturabo in grand parades or public ceremonies to showcase his indispensable role in the Imperium. Perturabo's engineering genius and artistic sensibilities were often overlooked in favor of his military prowess, providing him with opportunities to exercise creativity and construct great works of architecture might have given him an outlet for his talents and an obvious way to then praise him for the work that he does. Say, oh wow, this building you made is so great because you're great, you know. Instead of just building fortresses and supply chains for the military effort, he might have designed grand cities, monuments, something for a cultural institution maybe, design a university or something. Embody the higher ideals of the Imperium. Allow him to express his artistic side, to give him a sense of accomplishment and pride beyond the battlefield. Maybe encourage him to collaborate with Fulgrim or Sanguinius, some of the more artistically minded of the Primarchs, on projects that celebrate beauty in a giant building form. Perturabo's frustration often stemmed from feeling that his work was thankless. By redefining the narrative around his contributions, they might have been framed as heroic and visionary, elevating his efforts from drudgery to acts of greatness, emphasizing how his work protected and empowered billions of imperial citizens might have given him a sense of purpose and pride. Reframing a civilian role as not just administrative but transformational might have ensured that he understood the vital importance of his tasks and how valued those tasks were by the Emperor. Highlight how his logistical genius helped survive the survival of a world or a sector during bad agricultural output on some agri-world due to a war or some such. Give him a grand title to reflect the indispensable nature of his work. Formalize institutions to study and preserve his designs. Maybe dedicate them or name them after him. Give him a legacy and a sense of purpose. The Perturabo College of Engineering and Architecture, maybe. Something. Maybe have him collaborate with other Primarchs? Collaboration with other Primarchs might have helped Perturabo feel less isolated and more appreciated. Working alongside brothers who admired and respected his talents might have given him the camaraderie that he often lacked. If done well, it may have also helped him to receive the accolade which he would have never sought out on his own. Pairing him with another Primarch and having that Primarch compliment him on the work he's doing during their time together might have let him feel like a vital part of a team. Such a collaboration could have created opportunities for emotional connection and mutual support, which were very difficult for him and for anyone around him. He had an abrasive personality. So yeah, this wouldn't be guaranteed, but whatever. Maybe assign Perturabo and Gilliman as co-leads on the reconstruction of post-war worlds to blend their strengths in governance and logistics. Maybe involve Perturabo in cultural projects with Fulgrim. Fulgrim, for sure, was a shameless self-promoter. If Fulgrim's glory was tied to Perturabo being recognized, you can be sure he would have been right up there saying, hey, Perturabo was great, he and I worked together on this thing, and it went really well because we're both great. Perturabo's sense of isolation and bitterness grew because he felt unsupported and misunderstood. Ensuring that he had a supportive team or community that respected his genius and valued his input would have been essential. He needed trusted advisors, capable subordinates from outside the Legion, maybe custodes assigned as advisors who recognized his brilliance. He needed someone from outside to validate his self-worth. Ensuring that his accomplishments were celebrated within his immediate circle of influence could have created a sense of belonging. Perhaps a small council of senior engineers and logistics experts who revered Perturabo's vision might have been able to offer him some actual constructive help, even though they're human. Maybe appoint emissaries or advocates who could communicate his successes to other parts of the Imperium. Perturabo would have done well given opportunities to mentor. Perturabo's intellect and experience could have thus been passed on to a new generation of logistics experts, engineers, and civilian leaders, perhaps mentoring them, making sure that he put his stamp on the worlds that he had conquered and moved on from, would have given him a sense of purpose and pride, allowing him to see his values then perpetuated on an ongoing basis in the Imperium. Perhaps guiding and teaching talented individuals might have led him to focus on building a legacy of excellence. We mentioned earlier the Perturabo College of Architecture and Engineering or whatever. Train future architects and engineers in the Imperium. Maybe have a Perturabo Academy of Logistics to train future administrators. Assign him to mentor promising planetary governors or Munitorum logistics experts. Really, like many of his brothers, what Perturabo needed was regular acknowledgement of his efforts by the Emperor or by his brothers. Outside approval was critical for Perturabo because he never received it from his father on Olympia. Receiving regular praise and recognition from the emperor would have reinforced his sense of worth and lessened his bitterness. The emperor could have given Perturabo personal commendations or granted him symbolic items of appreciation. Maybe give him the authority to create a signature fortress world, or the power to oversee major sectors of the Imperium, to show how much he trusts him. Have the Emperor or some of the other Primarchs acknowledge Perturabo's role in safeguarding humanity's future. Just anything to counter his feelings of neglect. Perturabo felt isolated from those around him, because he pushed away his brothers, and he intentionally distanced himself from his sons. If he had been surrounded by capable, loyal individuals who respected his genius and supported his goals, maybe that would have helped to alleviate this loneliness, even if those individuals were initially pushed upon him by the emperor or Horus. Appointing trusted advisors, such as custodes or respected tech experts from, for example, the Iron Hands, to work closely with Perturabo, might have provided camaraderie and practical support. Encouraging a mentorship dynamic between Perturabo and talented engineers or experts assigned to him might have helped him to feel valued as a teacher and leader. Look, the reason we need this gigantic list of stuff to try to help Perturabo is that he was not beyond redemption, but it would have taken a lot of work. It all comes down to his emotional well-being, more specifically, the lack thereof. Perturabo's bitterness and resentment stemmed from his emotional wounds, his sense of being overshadowed and undervalued. Providing him with opportunities for emotional healing and connection so he could move past his daddy issues that he got from that asshole on Olympia, whose name I've forgotten, would have been vital. Ensuring that the Emperor or some of his brother Primarchs openly acknowledged his contributions and sacrifices could have gone a long way toward easing his pain and helping him to feel valued, allowing him to take on roles that aligned with his strengths and maybe spare him the humiliation of being constantly compared to others, like Dorn, would have helped to mitigate his insecurities. The Imperium needed for Perturabo to not feel burdened overmuch. He needed his responsibilities to be framed as opportunities for legacy building rather than burdensome chores. Provide Perturabo with the resources and autonomy he needed to execute his vision without micromanagement, and then praise him when he does a good job. Avoid pitting Perturabo's contributions against those of his brothers to prevent resentment. Emphasize that his role was uniquely vital to the Imperium's survival. For God's sake, Horus, do not ask Perturabo if he could overcome the defenses of the Imperial Palace. All that does is immediately pit Perturabo's worst emotional flaws against Dorn's worst emotional flaws. Yes, Perturabo occasionally needed criticism. Everyone does. But critiques of Perturabo's work needed to be constructive and balanced with genuine praise for his successes to help him feel supported rather than scrutinized. The custodes, specifically, are real bad for this. In canon, they're constantly talking mad shit and never compliment people. They think they're so good. To help Perturabo feel the admiration, appreciation, and support he craved in a civilian role, it would have been critical to frame his responsibilities as opportunities to create a lasting legacy, publicly celebrate his achievements, and provide meaningful collaboration and recognition from his peers. Maybe the Emperor, if he's not going to be a huge asshole about it. By focusing on his strengths as a visionary and creator, While addressing his emotional needs for validation and belonging, Perturabo could have thrived in either his military role or in any number of civilian roles to reshape the Imperium's infrastructure. A lot of these lessons would have applied just as well to not just his service in the Great Crusade, but also a bunch of other Primarchs' work in the Great Crusade. Fuck! I'm calm now. Okay. The last great action of the Iron Warriors prior to falling to chaos was quelling a rebellion on their home world of Olympia. This occurred shortly after the aforementioned Saktrata Deeps and Golgis campaigns against the Hrud, so the Iron Warriors had already been upset and dispirited by horrible campaigns with terrible losses. Learning that their homeworld itself was undergoing insurrection, that they would become known as the only legion, well, I don't know about the world leaders. Anyway, the only legion to be unable to maintain order in their own home world was a strike against their pride. Now, according to the novel The First Heretic, this rebellion had been instigated by word-bearers' agents. I shall leave it up to you, the audience, to decide whether you believe that or not. There's lots of reasons for people to rebel. Anyway, the Iron Warriors flipped right out. They demanded that the civilian population of Olympia be punished by decimation, a grim rhyme with Perturabo's initial ascendancy to leadership of the Iron Warriors. They reconquered Olympia, enslaved the populace as punishment for resisting, and in the process they killed many Iron Warriors Marines who objected in an atrocity which rhymes with the later Istvan III massacre. Those Iron Warriors who escaped, of course, later became Black Shields during the Horus Heresy. We can see excellent foreshadowing there of the Iron Warriors' actions at Olympia and their later actions during the Horus Heresy, as well as rhymes looking backwards to the decimation they endured under Perturabo. Thus, we should look. How do the actions of the Iron Warriors during the rebellion of Olympia inform us of their character? They don't just tell us about the Iron Warriors' collective character and internal struggles. They also tell us about Perturabo's deep flaws through the toxic culture he had fostered within the Legion. The events of Olympia are the prime example of their bitterness, resentment, and the dangerous extremes they were willing to go in pursuit of their ideals. The Iron Warriors had ruthlessness and brutality, evident in their complete and merciless suppression of the rebellion on Olympia, culminating in widespread slaughter of civilians. This almost genocidal campaign demonstrated their willingness to use overwhelming force without regard for civilian casualties, a hallmark of their siegecraft and total war philosophy. This brutality was emotional, a release of pent-up frustration and resentment against a population they saw as ungrateful and weak. Thus, their actions reflect how their long-term bitterness and dehumanization during the Great Crusade led to unrestrained violence. The Iron Warriors felt unappreciated and alienated, so then they unleashed their rage indiscriminately. Their toxic resentment had corrupted their ideals of duty and service. The Iron Warriors internalized their grievances. So this rebellion confirmed the Iron Warriors' belief that they were undervalued and betrayed by those who they served. Perturabo viewed the rebellion as the ultimate insult, not just to himself, though he did mostly think of himself, but also to the sacrifices of his legion. And so this led to an emotional overreaction. The Legion and Perturabo both saw conquest of Olympia as a way to reassert their control. They punished perceived disloyalty, or actual disloyalty, depending on canon, with disproportionate vengeance, because they weren't just trying to take control of Olympia again. They were trying to feel in control themselves. The Iron Warriors Legion was unable to process rejection or failure constructively. Rather than addressing their emotional wounds or seeking resolution, they doubled down on destructive tendencies, deepening their spiral into resentment. Perturabo's personal vendetta against Olympia heavily influenced the Iron Warriors' actions. Perturabo saw Olympia's rebellion as a personal betrayal, rooted in his fraught relationship with his adoptive father, and thus, in his mind, with the citizens of Olympia. His decision to enact brutal reprisals and decimation of the civilian population reflected his inability to separate personal grievances from leadership responsibilities. The Iron Warriors Legion, meanwhile, was trained to obey without question, and they mirrored Perturabo's bitterness, so they followed his lead for the most part unquestioningly. Now, again, there were elements who resisted this action, and they were mostly purged. Some of them escaped. The Iron Warriors' collective identity was deeply intertwined with Perturabo's personality. His bitterness, perfectionism, and inability to forgive shaped their culture, making the Iron Warriors Legion prone to extremes of wrath. The massacre at Olympia led to significant fractures within the Legion, which tells us quite a bit about their internal politics. Many of the Iron Warriors, well, many is a stretch, a plurality of the Iron Warriors, there we go, were horrified by the scale of the atrocity, and thus questioned Perturabo's leadership. Perturabo, of course, ordered those individuals killed, but he wasn't the only one. If I understand it right from canon, other Iron Warriors Marines just straight up decided, these other people aren't on board with the plan, gotta kill them. This internal dissent thus further alienated Perturabo from his legion, as he viewed such questioning as betrayal, leading to even harsher discipline for those who remained with him, and cementing his legion's toxicity. This rebellion shows quite clearly the schism within the Legion between their ideals of duty and the reality of their actions. This tension, of course, foreshadows their eventual fragmentation under chaos, where these unresolved grievances would erupt into full-blown warband rivalries. There are some great novels about that. I think the character's name is Hansu. It's been a while since I read those. Anyway, the actions at Olympia were emblematic of the Iron Warriors' growing disillusionment with the Imperium. Their treatment of their own homeworld symbolizes their breaking point, severing one of their last emotional connections to the wider Imperium, and this massacre reinforces their sense of being tools of destruction, discarded and betrayed even by those that they sought to protect. This event was the critical step in their descent into chaos. The rebellion and its aftermath revealed their vulnerability to the promises of chaos, power, validation, the chance to strike back at those who had wronged them, and their feeling that they were unforgivable after Olympia meant that they were happy to take any alternative. We can see a theme here. The Night Lords, under Conrad Kors, later destroyed their own home world. The World Eaters, under Angron, destroyed their home world of Nuceria, though the exact manner of this changes over time with canon. I think the most recent canon in the Horus Heresy novels is that it's like destroyed by a warp storm or something after a battle against the Ultramarines there. Whatever. So those two traitor legions destroyed their homeworlds. The Iron Warriors brutally reconquered their homeworld, whereas in contrast, Guilliman's handling of rebellion on Ultramar, even before meeting the Emperor, is marked by efficiency and fairness, emphasizing reconstruction and moving forward, rather than just retribution after retribution. And thus we can see these different leadership styles rhyme with the fates of their respective legions. The rebellion of Olympia, and more importantly, the Iron Warriors' brutal reconquest, was the turning point for the Iron Warriors. It laid bare their flaws, their resentment, bitterness, and propensity for extreme measures, and it revealed the toxic relationship between Perturabo and his legion, where his emotional wounds and inability to foster loyalty through respect set the stage for their eventual fall. Narratively, the massacre at Olympia serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked resentment and the need for leaders to address emotional and relational needs, in themselves and in those that they lead. Primarchs had been punished several times before by the Emperor, that is, prior to the Olympia Rebellion. There is some evidence within the canon novels of 40k that the 2nd and 11th Forgotten Primarchs had been executed on Terra at the direct order of the Emperor. The Word-Bearers were chastised by the Emperor in person at Monarchia. The World Eaters were chastised by Leman Russ at the direction of the Emperor for killing a bunch of civilians, and the Thousand Sons saw the ban on psychic powers at the Council of Nicaea as a repudiation of their legion. I believe that the Battle of Prospero had not happened yet at this point in canon. In the aftermath of the massacre at Olympia, Perturabo felt remorse and fear that he might be sanctioned by the Emperor, and he sought counsel in Horus, who had already fallen to chaos by then. I feel that if Perturabo had a closer relationship with even one currently, Primarch who was loyal at the time, contemporarily loyal Primarch, that's the phrasing, to ask for help, they might have prevented Perturabo's fall. He was right on the edge at that moment. Could have gone either way. Let's examine the possibility of Perturabo turning to Rogel Dorn, or Sanguinius, instead of Horus. This counterfactual scenario highlights themes of brotherhood, redemption, and the failure of relationships among the Primarchs. Rogel Dorn's a tough one. There were some strengths of that potential connection. They had a mutual understanding of duty. Both Perturabo and Dorn were tasked with immense responsibilities as siege experts, often being assigned grueling campaigns or defenseless tasks which sometimes went unthanked and with a lack of validation. Dorn could have empathized with Perturabo's frustrations over feeling undervalued and overburdened. While they clashed in temperament, both valued the ideals of loyalty and duty. Dorn's unwavering commitment might have allowed him to remind Perturabo of the importance of their shared mission, helping him to process his guilt over Olympia constructively. If Dorn had seen Perturabo's plea for help as a genuine opportunity for reconciliation, he might have taken that option. He might have offered validation and perspective that the Emperor, their father, often withheld. Dorn's ability to balance sternness with a moral compass could have guided Perturabo towards accepting his mistake without succumbing to despair or anger, and thus by turning to Dorn instead of Horus, Perturabo might have avoided a fatal entanglement with chaos. Dorn's loyalty and clarity of purpose could have reinforced Perturabo's resolve to remain true to the Imperium. On the other hand, Dorn lost his marbles upon hearing that Conrad Kurz had opened up about his own fears and feelings with his mentor Fulgrim. So maybe Dorn's not the best choice. Sanguinius is, as often is true, the better option. Sanguinius was the emotional anchor of the Primarchs. He was renowned for his empathy and his ability to inspire. His compassion might have provided Perturabo with the understanding and validation he so desperately craved. Sanguinius's own struggles with foreknowledge of his death, the temptations of chaos from the Cygnus campaign, which I believe had happened by then, and the genetic flaws of his legion, gave him insight into coping with overwhelming burdens. He could have shared this wisdom with Perturabo, framing the massacre at Olympia as a chance to grow rather than a reason to despair. Sanguinius might have helped Perturabo to find a path to atone for his actions, possibly guiding him toward reconciliation with the Emperor and the Imperium. By forming a bond with Sanguinius, Perturabo might have developed a stronger connection to other loyalist Primarchs by using Sanguinius as a bridge to them, reducing his sense of isolation. And Sanguinius's charisma and optimism could have reignited Perturabo's sense of purpose, offering him a new vision for his role in the Imperium, even after a terrible mistake. If Dorn had responded well, he would have approached Perturabo's plea with a focus on duty and the practical steps necessary to regain the Emperor's favor. His stern demeanor might have been challenging for Perturabo to accept, but their shared sense of honor might have fostered mutual respect. Meanwhile, Sanguinius's approach would have been more emotional and empathetic, emphasizing personal growth and redemption. His gentler manner might have been more effective in addressing Perturabo's emotional wounds, though perhaps less likely to involve the resolution of a professional rivalry. This counterfactual scenario here underscores the tragic failure of the Primarchs to act as a true brotherhood. If Perturabo had felt able to rely on another of his brothers, rather than seeking Horus, who was technically his superior, he might have found the support he needed to remain loyal. The Emperor's failure to foster deeper connections between his sons, or perhaps even his intentional decision to not foster connections between his sons, is highlighted here. If the Emperor had recognized the importance of emotional ties among the Primarchs, and if the Emperor had been less concerned with the potential for the Primarchs to become more loyal to each other than to himself, perhaps he might have allowed Perturabo the mental and emotional space to seek help. Perturabo's fall is more poignant when viewed through this lens of missed opportunities for redemption. His potential to remain loyal was undone in part by his inherent flaws, and in part by how people had treated him and his legion for decades, but even more so by the lack of a supportive relationship at a critical moment. Thus, if Perturabo had sought counsel from Dorn or Sanguinius instead of Horus, the trajectory of his life and the fate of the Iron Warriors might have been quite different. We have already established the central theme of unmet emotional needs among the Primarchs. Well, here we see it. Small moments of understanding and support could have changed the course of history in 40K. The tragedy of Perturabo lies in his actions, yes, but also in the relationships which were never built. Instead, Perturabo fell. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors did not carry out a planned internal purge of loyalists in the same dramatic manner as the Istvan III betrayal. Instead, their descent into treachery was more gradual and systemic, shaped by their resentment, bitterness, and Perturabo's growing alignment with Horus. While individual loyalists or dissenters at Olympia were dealt with harshly, there was no planned large-scale culling of loyalist elements within the Legion. It just happened organically during the purge at Olympia. Now, why was there not a larger portion of the Legion which resisted Perturabo's directions at Olympia? Well, the Iron Warriors had been molded by Perturabo into a highly disciplined and unquestioningly obeying legion. Years of grueling siege warfare, at least one decimation, and harsh discipline had eroded the capacity for dissent within their ranks. Thus, the vast majority followed Perturabo without question. They did not have a counterbalancing personal loyalty to the emperor, nor, in many cases, to their own internal conscience. By the time the Iron Warriors fully committed to Horus's rebellion, they had already become deeply disillusioned with the Imperium, and their participation in the Olympia massacre was just the last straw, where the Legion's moral and emotional compass fractured. Those who had participated in the massacre felt their fear of the Emperor's retribution outweigh any residual loyalty to him. With the Sons of Horus, or the Emperor's children, for example, there are specific moments of corruption leading to a clear divide. But the Iron Warriors' fall was more of a slow collective descent during the Great Crusade. Descent, D-E-S-C-E-N-T. Or earlier we were talking about dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T. English is hard. Anyway, Marines who expressed loyalty to the Emperor and the ideals of the Imperium, and on urge to avoid widespread massacre of civilians at Olympia, were thus isolated and silenced by their peers. The Legion's culture left no room for them to raise an alternative view, and Perturabo's authoritarian leadership style had been discouraging rebellion through the use of harsh punishments, threats of death, and occasionally actual executions or decimations. So the idea of killing other Iron Warriors was already an option in their mind. Now, this has interesting implications for the Iron Warriors. The lack of a dramatic Istvan III-style purge contributed to the Iron Warriors' slower glide path into the outright worship of chaos compared to other traitor legions. They joined the rebellion out of bitterness, disillusionment, and fear, not out of religious fervor. They viewed chaos as a tool. And by not dividing their forces early on, they remained a cohesive fighting force throughout the Horus Heresy, right up until the Iron Cage. Now, yes, there were isolated incidents of Iron Warriors who defected to the Loyalists, serving as Black Shields. However, these were individuals for the most part, not like whole companies and whatever. Thus, the Iron Warriors' fall into treachery was marked by systemic disillusionment and Perturabo's authoritarian leadership, ensuring unity within the traitors without the need for a dramatic, pre-planned purge. Their slow, methodical descent into heresy thus stands as a counterpoint to the dramatic betrayals of the legions present at Istvan III. We can see this as a metaphor for the psychological toll of neglect and resentment over time. Perturabo, of course, was then fully brought into the fold just prior to the drop site massacre by the proselytization of Lorgar, but we'll get into that when we talk about him later. Now, Perturabo's actions during the Horus Heresy, the Iron Cage, and his later campaigns after ascending to daemonhood provide more insight into his character, revealing both the depth of his brilliance and his tragic flaws. We see a Primarch who is a victim of his own genius, pride and bitterness, which followed him even into immortality. During the Horus Heresy, Perturabo was in charge for much of it. Perturabo's master strategy and siege specialty and logistics expertise were absolutely necessary to the success of the traitors. His campaigns during the heresy, after the Drop Site Massacre, showcase his unparalleled expertise in, yes, siege warfare, systemically destroying loyalist fortifications, but also his logistics skill, calculatingly using his resources to demonstrate his intellectual prowess. Now, he did also continue to value crude victory over the lives of his soldiers. He had a cold, utilitarian view of warfare, prioritizing victory at all costs over the well-being of his troops or the preservation of their lives. For example, during the Void engagement at Fall against the Imperial Fists, the Iron Warriors lost multiple capital ships. We can see the continuing resentment of Perturabo towards Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists, fueling his participation in the rebellion. He saw the heresy as an opportunity to prove his worth and to settle perceived slights. His alliance with Horus was pragmatic rather than ideological. It reflected his disillusionment with the Emperor and the Imperium, rather than a deep conviction in chaos. The massacre at Olympia casts a long shadow over Perturabo's actions during the heresy. His participation in the atrocities of the Istvan V drop site massacre and various actions against the civilians during the Siege of Terra mirror the ruthlessness he had displayed during the suppression of Olympia's rebellion. What I see from this is a deep psychological wound that drove him to commit increasingly brutal acts to try to justify it to himself. He did this bad thing on Olympia. He's sided with Horus because of it. But now, if he keeps doing bad things like that, maybe they become good things. Perturabo's ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies came at the cost of his humanity. His ability to connect emotionally with others was exacerbated by the heresy, causing this tendency to spiral more and more purely. The Siege of Terra and the Battle of the Imperial Palace were Perturabo's attempts to prove himself the better of Rogel Dorn. After Horus failed to kill the Emperor, he moved on to his second plan, the Iron Cage, an elaborate trap to humiliate Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists, proving once and for all that Perturabo was the superior siege master. His meticulous planning and execution of the trap highlight his strategic brilliance, but the campaign also shows us his pettiness and inability to move past personal rivalries. Perturabo's willingness to sacrifice massive numbers of his own troops in the Iron Cage and sacrifice his legion's unity in the aftermath of the Iron Cage show us his expedient, utilitarian mindset and the erosion of his moral compass. Victory, even at great cost, was more important to him than preserving the lives of his warriors, or preserving the Legion as a unified force. The Iron Cage was a Pyrrhic victory. While he demonstrated his strategic genius by showing the folly of Rogel Dorn, it also showcased his own deep flaws, cementing his reputation as a cruel and ruthless leader, while also holding his ultimate victory, killing Dorn, tantalizingly out of reach. His subsequent reward, ascension to daemonhood, symbolized his full embrace of chaos and the final rejection of his former humanity. As a daemon prince of chaos, Perturabo became an embodiment of destruction and obsession. His campaigns aren't very well documented in canon, but they were generally driven by an endless hunger for annihilation and pursuit of even more destruction against the Imperium. So far as I can tell from the small amount of canon that's hinted at what he's doing now, his focus has shifted to grand apocalyptic projects, weapons of incredible destructive power, reflecting his continued need to prove himself on a cosmic scale. So, Games Workshop will come up with some way to bring him out as a big bad. That'll be nice. But among the traitor legions, Perturabo has remained isolated. As far as I can tell, he's never really aligned himself with Abaddon's Black Crusades, His cold demeanor, his disdain for chaos worship of any particular power, and his using of other people as tools has left him with few allies. Thus, bringing it into a full circle, his isolation mirrors his earlier life and reinforces his status to himself as a misunderstood genius. Perturabo's ascension to daemonhood was thus a curse. Trapped in the service of chaos, he became a being of endless war, unable to escape the cycle of destruction and bitterness and failure to achieve his ultimate goals that had defined his life. We see once again, once someone ascends to daemonhood, they stop changing and growing. Perturabo's need for recognition and validation was never fulfilled in his life by the Emperor or his brothers, and thus continued to be unfulfilled in his unlife as a daemon. His bitterness and attempts to seek validation through increasingly destructive and self-destructive means flow directly from that. Perturabo's intelligence and talent for siegecraft became both his greatest strength and his undoing. His brilliance isolated him, and his inability to understand or value emotional connections deepened his descent. And so we can see him as a mirror to the Imperium of 40k, with his flaw reflecting many of the flaws of the Imperium itself: cold, utilitarian, blind to the emotional needs of its subjects and citizens. His story serves as a critique of the Imperium's failure to nurture its most valuable assets, its people. Perturabo's life on Olympia, during the Great Crusade, during the heresy, and then after the heresy and into his daemonhood, is just one of endless war and lack of emotional fulfillment. It's a testament to the futility and destructiveness of both war and daemonhood. His eternal existence as a daemon prince ensures that he will never find peace, a tragic irony for one who once sought to master the world around him. Perturabo's story thus contrasts sharply with Rogel Dorn, who remained loyal but shared a similar obsession with duty and fortification. His bitterness and eventual fall honestly parallels Angron pretty closely. We might also see a need for external validation, making his story the parallel of that of Lorgar. Lorgar sought validation through faith, whereas Perturabo sought validation through perfection. Perturabo's arc is this great narrative of unfulfilled potential, emotional isolation, complete genius which goes unappreciated, and a lack of compassion, either for himself or between himself and others. Now, so far we have discussed the Primarchs, Angron, Fulgrim, and Perturabo, who ascended to daemonhood following the Horus Heresy, who had all ascended to daemonhood by the end of the Iron Cage campaign then. Sure, Angron and Fulgrim were already daemons during the Horus Heresy. From these examples, it seems there is a through line. Daemonhood is granted to ensure that they cannot heal their emotional wounds, keeping them stuck in their worst selves in order to ensure their eternal servitude to chaos. Daemonhood is framed by chaos as the ultimate reward for service to chaos, but it is in truth a cruel trap. For those who ascend, it is not liberation, but eternal enslavement to their worst traits, placing their unmet needs forever out of reach, and ensuring their continued utility to the ruinous powers. Fulgrim's pursuit of personal perfection and sensory experience reached its apogee in daemonhood, but it turned his ambition into a bottomless pit. No matter how much he throws into it, it can never be filled. He is trapped in an endless cycle of seeking pleasure and beauty, but he can never find satisfaction. His daemonhood ensures that he can never reconcile with his own guilt or the relationships he destroyed, like when he killed Ferrus Manus. This leaves Fulgrim perpetually hollow despite his power. Angron's emotional wounds, rooted in his slavery, the Emperor's betrayal of his need for brotherhood, and his abandonment, manifest as an unending rage. His daemonhood as Khorne's champion ensures that he can never escape the chain of violence that defined his life. And the Butcher's nails are ensured to never leave him. They were originally a physical problem and a psychological curse, but they became less physical and more spiritual upon his ascension, ensuring that his mind remains trapped in the cycle they enforce, making him unable to ever escape their pain, making him unable to ever find peace or healing. Meanwhile, Perturabo's bitterness, desire for recognition, and obsession with war and proving himself are frozen into place by his daemonhood. His existence is now one of endless sieges and destruction, his genius wasted on ruin rather than creation, his emotional wounds of feeling undervalued and betrayed can never be soothed. Instead, he is condemned to lash out endlessly in a futile attempt to prove himself. No one else, he feels, can be trusted to validate him. So he pushes everyone away so they don't get the chance, and then he tries to prove himself to himself, but he's never going to accept that. The Chaos Gods thus grant daemonhood not just as a reward for merit, but more importantly as a curse, to permanently bind their champions to their service. Yeah, Perturabo is a daemon of Chaos Undivided. Whatever. It still works. They amplify the Primarchs' already existing worst traits and already existing flawed attempts to meet their own emotional needs in order to make sure that they will remain tools of destruction and never meet their emotional needs. Listen, I can't harp on this too much, and you're already hours into this, so you're going to keep listening. Chaos preys on unhealed wounds. The Primarch's ascension crystallizes their pain and magnifies it, ensuring that they are too consumed by their flaws to rebel or find purpose beyond serving chaos. They are kept in eternal servitude, either in direct enslavement to a specific chaos god or in more general service to the manifold cause of Chaos Undivided. The powers granted by daemonhood are immense, but they are designed to serve chaos, not the individual who holds them. The Primarchs lose some autonomy and any hope of self-actualization, and the immortal and unchanging nature of daemonhood makes healing impossible. They're no longer bound by the mortal constraints that might have forced introspection or allowed for growth. They are locked into their worst selves, serving as unliving embodiments of the will of chaos. Overall, the fate of the Daemon Primarchs serves as a cautionary tale and a reflection of chaos itself. The unfulfilled emotional needs of the Primarchs, for Perturabo, for example, validation, connection, purpose, are exploited by chaos to ensure their fall and entrapment. And then chaos does not heal or liberate, It perpetuates the suffering and flaws of its slaves. The Primarchs' daemonhood ensures that they cannot rise above their pain or their own mistakes. The ascension of these Primarchs thus shows the ultimate consequences of the Emperor's failure to address the Primarchs' emotional needs. Had those needs been met, perhaps their fates could have been different. And the Emperor sure wasn't going to meet their needs, so perhaps the Primarchs could have met each other's needs. Loyalist Primarchs, those who survived, while scarred, often found purpose in service or in their legacies, allowing for some measure of healing or redemption. Fallen Primarchs who did not ascend to daemonhood but instead died, Horus, Alpharius, Omegon, Conrad Kors, is that it? They represent Chaos's inability to fully control or entrap some of its pawns. It shows a nuanced relationship between Chaos and its servants. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Horus, Alpharius, Omegon, and Conrad Kors are the only dead among the traitor Primarchs. Yeah, gotta run through that in my head for a moment. The daemonhood of the Primarchs is a punishment. It's a means of keeping them bound to chaos in the depths of their worst selves. This eternal stagnation is the antithesis of growth or redemption, reinforcing the nihilistic nature of chaos and the tragic end to the moral arcs of the Primarchs who fall under its sway. These stories resonate with us because they remind us of the importance of addressing emotional wounds and the dangers of allowing pain to fester unchecked. If Perturabo had participated in the aforementioned fellowship program by switching leadership of a legion to another which was better liked, and there are several to choose from, Perturabo may have received more praise for ultimately similar performance. One hope is that it may have helped him to feel validated, but a risk is that he might grow in his bitterness directed at the Iron Warriors for holding him back, or greater bitterness at everyone else offering him compliments for being insincere. That is to say, if he had led a more beloved legion, it might have exposed Perturabo to the positive feedback and validation he craved. The legion would perform well. Others were already accustomed to giving that legion acclaim, so they would give it, and it might satisfy his need for recognition. Seeing how another legion operates might have helped him to internalize that praise and recognition, and to understand that it came from relationship building and emotional intelligence rather than raw results. Now that one's a bit of a stretch. It's hard to tell whether Perturabo could have ever been that self-aware. But whatever. Working alongside, or more likely temporarily leading another legion, might have shown Perturabo how camaraderie and morale building contribute to success. Leading a legion with strong internal cohesion might have thus offered Perturabo a blueprint for fostering similar unity within the Iron Warriors upon his return. And hopefully, a fellowship would disrupt Perturabo's mentality, showing him that collaboration and mutual respect were possible across the legions, and showing him that he could have brotherhood with whoever he had switched with through similar experience. Seeing firsthand that not all Primarchs or legions receive universal praise, that indeed whatever legion he'd led or been a part of did receive criticism from time to time, might have tempered his sense of injustice. Oh, people say mean things about the Ultramarines too sometimes. That sort of idea. But once again, there's the Iron Warriors to consider. If Perturabo felt more successful or appreciated while leading another legion, perhaps he might have then seen the Iron Warriors as deadweight, or holding him back, alienating him from his legion. Conversely, he might feel that their perceived lack of worth reflected poorly on him, thus exacerbating his insecurities. Now, all of that is if he accepted the praise, but he'd spent his leadership in the Iron Warriors teaching them that they were too strong to need outside validation. He thus might interpret positive feedback as hollow or patronizing. Any success during his fellowship might thus be dismissed internally as being unearned, undermining its value in causing him to actually change himself. If the fellowship placed him in close proximity to Primarchs who excelled in diplomacy or charisma, it might help him, or it might highlight his weaknesses and worsen his self-esteem. Perturabo's bitterness and sense of inferiority might lead to conflict with other Primarchs during the fellowship, especially those more favored by the Emperor. So there are risks associated with it, but overall I think it might be a good idea. There are some mitigating factors which might lead to those weaknesses being less important. Carefully pairing Perturabo with a Primarch whose strengths complement his weakness, and therefore whose legion's strengths complement Perturabo's weaknesses, might reduce these risks and foster growth. And working alongside a legion with a culture of humility might soften Perturabo's cynicism about praise and recognition. Perhaps a longer-term fellowship would be better for him than shorter term, so that Perturabo might see sustained success and receive consistent feedback. If the Iron Warriors could experience cultural exchange, there we go, words are hard, with a better liked legion, that might prevent feelings of resentment from either side. And of course, the fellowship would need support from the Emperor and Custodes. If the Emperor had personally initiated or praised the idea of the fellowship program, Perturabo might have thus viewed it as an opportunity to grow rather than as a slight, and a custodian observer in each legion might help to mediate conflicts or provide validation throughout the process. Now, there are questions there. How would the paired legion react to Perturabo's leadership? Would they resist his methods or question his decisions? And would this worsen his feelings of isolation? What would be the impact on the Iron Warriors from the leadership of a different Primarch? Would they feel abandoned by Perturabo? Would they feel resentful of him? Or conversely, would they benefit from experiencing another leadership style? Even if a fellowship provided temporary validation, would it lead to lasting change in Perturabo's behavior and mindset? Or would he revert back to his old patterns once back with the Iron Warriors? We don't even need permanent change. We would only need it to last until the heresy. But might the experience of success in another context, that is, another legion, embolden him to challenge the Emperor's perceived neglect more constructively? Thus, the fellowship program, like any good idea, has some concerns and flaws. It has the potential to provide the recognition and perspective which he desperately needed, but it also risked reinforcing his bitterness and mistrust. A carefully designed program with thoughtful pairings and ongoing support might have helped to prevent his fall, but the deeply ingrained nature of Perturabo's insecurities and his tendency to interpret events through a lens of resentment would have meant there would still be risks involved. It would have been a delicate and challenging proposition. I feel that, in general, a well-executed fellowship would likely be more effective earlier rather than later. The World Eaters before the widespread application of the butcher's nails, for example. It just needs to be enough time for the Primarchs of both legions to establish their own leadership style and for their legions to form an identity, but still early enough that they can later use their experience from the Fellowship program to grow and change. In the early stages of their participation in the Great Crusade, when the Primarchs were still forming their leadership styles and building their legions, but their personalities had not fully crystallized, there was a crucial window when emotional needs might have been met, rivalries tempered, and the Primarchs' more destructive tendencies curbed before they became entrenched. The butcher's nails are the most obvious option. Before the widespread adoption of the butcher's nails, the World Eaters were still grappling with their identity under Angron. This period thus presents an opportunity for another Primarch to influence their trajectory in a positive manner. We went on a discussion earlier about pairing Angron with Vulcan. I believe that is the right choice. It would help to redirect the Legion's focus towards compassion or honor, mitigating their eventual descent into savagery. The Primarchs, early on, were still adapting to their roles within the Imperium, thus making them more open to new ideas and new perspectives. Early fellowships might help Primarchs like Perturabo or Angron avoid becoming defined by their flaws. At this stage, the legions themselves were still forming their cultures and traditions. A fellowship might thus introduce another perspective, maybe a positive influence, before destructive patterns become ingrained. Notably, the Iron Warriors might have benefited from exposure to a different perspective from a different Primarch, who would not only treat them differently with a different leadership style, but also would have almost certainly worked to get them validation from outside. Early interactions between the Primarchs might foster camaraderie and mutual respect, reducing the likelihood that a rivalry or animosity would persist. If a strong bond had been able to form between the Iron Warriors and the Imperial Fists, for example, it might have mitigated their animosity and later hostility. By making the legions into pairs through the Primarch project, it might prevent isolation. Primarchs who felt isolated or undervalued, Angron, Perturabo, Kurz, and also Primarchs who intentionally went off on their own to isolate themselves, Jagatai Khan, might have found validation and understanding through close collaboration with a more empathetic sibling, or might have found more understanding through being forced to work alongside someone else when they would have preferred to be on their own. Meanwhile, late in the game, resentments were already entrenched. Even before the heresy began, many Primarchs had already developed deep-seated grievances, rivalries, or fatalistic outlooks, which would have been harder to reverse. Perturabo's bitterness, Angron's rage, and Kurz's despair were deeply ingrained by this stage, and their legions had already formed identities. By the roughly mid to late Crusade, legions had largely cemented their cultures, making it difficult for new influences to take root. After the World Eaters adopted the butcher's nails, for example, their identity was solidified as brutal berserkers, and only the Emperor himself could have potentially worked to change their culture by, for example, banning the butcher's nails and imprisoning those who already had them. Later fellowships would have risked exacerbating tensions between rival Primarchs, as their egos and grievances were already inflamed. On to other matters. In Master of Prospero, by Graham McNeill, Magnus and Perturabo have a somewhat close relationship based on their shared appreciation for knowledge. Perhaps this friendship could have blossomed if properly nurtured with mutual attention and proximity. But by the Horus Heresy, it seems instead that their potential friendship had withered. That's so sad. Another opportunity gone. I feel there was a possibility that Perturabo could have formed friendships by campaigning closely with certain other Primarchs, not during sieges, thus gaining the opportunity for them to show mutual admiration for each other's legions. Let us consider other methods which may have been useful in helping Perturabo to gain the companionship and friendship he desperately needed, while avoiding the psychological roadblock of him having convinced himself that he doesn't want to show anyone that he wants companionship and friendship. Perturabo is one of the most difficult of the Primarchs to try to fix their emotional problems. It would require subtle approaches, respecting his guarded nature and avoiding making him feel vulnerable or exposed. The methods would need to emphasize mutual respect, shared goals, and opportunities for admiration, without forcing him to explicitly acknowledge his emotional needs. Here's a couple ideas. Maybe collaborative projects on a grand scale. We talked earlier about architecture stuff. This just moves on from that. Perturabo thrived in environments where he could display his skills and receive acknowledgement for his genius without needing to directly seek acknowledgement. Collaborative projects with other Primarchs on massive infrastructure, fortification, logistical, or architecture systems might have perhaps provided opportunities for camaraderie. By working together, Perturabo might witness other Primarchs' respect for Perturabo's abilities. Maybe help him lower his guard, maybe form bonds, maybe building or fortifying a major hub world or a strategic stronghold alongside another Primarch might have fostered mutual admiration for their complementary expertise, or designing a system of interstellar logistics with Theris Manus, emphasizing their shared love for engineering. Perturabo was deeply competitive and craved validation for his accomplishments. Perhaps the Emperor or Horus might have organized competitions or challenges between the Primarchs, framed as opportunities to showcase their strengths, and maybe this might have fostered mutual respect. These events might have served as a neutral way for other Primarchs to admire Perturabo's skills, without making him feel patronized. That is, not saying, hey, go say nice things about your brother. Instead, making a contest that Perturabo would be good at, and then when he's good at it, people say nice things to him for winning the contest. Maybe a contest to design planetary defense systems or complex infrastructure projects. Organizing war games where Perturabo could demonstrate his strategic brilliance alongside or against his brothers in a controlled, constructive environment. Or maybe a contest just out in the crusade. Give them roughly similar worlds, tell them to bring them into compliance. First one to get the most worlds wins, you know. Maybe a more intellectual framework. We talked about Magnus earlier. Maybe an intellectual circle or forum might have been a good option. Perturabo's keen intellect and interest in philosophy, mathematics, and engineering might have made him a good participant in intellectual gatherings with the other more bookish Primarchs, Magnus, Lorgar. Maybe these settings might have allowed Perturabo to bond through the exchange of ideas rather than through overt displays of emotion, which he might find uncomfortable. Maybe a forum where the Primarchs can get together to discuss technological advancements or ideals for governance reform. Maybe a council of strategists where Perturabo could collaborate and debate with peers. Just anything besides having all the Primarchs on the front lines all the time, isolated from each other, Maybe shared mentorship of Imperial officers. Perturabo might have found satisfaction and connection in mentoring promising human officers or commanders, and it might have allowed him to find connection with other Primarchs in jointly mentoring a group of human officers. This shared responsibility might create bonds through the mutual goal of shaping the Imperium's future leadership. Witnessing mutual respect from the officers and the other Primarch might reinforce Perturabo's value and sense that he is valued, without requiring him to ask for validation. We talked earlier about maybe the educational side of things, with Fulgrim, with elite educational institutions, and maybe architecture and engineering sort of stuff with Perturabo. But honestly, any of the Primarchs would be great for an Imperial War College sort of thing. Maybe oversee joint training campaigns that test and develop their officers' skills on the battlefield. I'm not going to say real world. It's still a fictional universe. Anyway, Perturabo's artistic side was often overshadowed by his engineering brilliance and his military endeavors, but maybe a collaborative artistic effort with brothers who shared aesthetic appreciation for creation might have provided him with a low-pressure avenue for connection. Give Perturabo a chance to express himself while bonding with others. With certain loyalist Primarchs, it is difficult to find deep enough emotional wounds to build a reasonable case for them falling to chaos. But I believe it's still a useful endeavor to look at them because it gives us perspective when trying to find emotional resilience in the traitor Primarchs to build a case for how their emotional needs could have been met. What can we learn from Dorn that we could use in our consideration of Perturabo? Looking at them in parallel, highlighting their shared experiences as masters of siege and fortification warfare, and how that shaped their psyches, relationships, and eventual fates, shows us both their similarities, their differences in how they processed their emotional needs, and how they handled recognition and how they approached their duties. This gives us some insight into why one, Dorn, remained loyal, while the other, Perturabo, fell. By looking at Dorn's strengths and vulnerabilities, we can thus better understand where Perturabo might have been salvaged if his emotional needs had been met. There are some key lessons from Dorn which we might apply to Perturabo. The importance of purpose and acceptance. Dorn found this purpose and validation in being the Emperor's Praetorian, a role that gave his immense skill in fortification a direct and meaningful application. Despite the emotional toll, this sense of purpose anchored him and gave him a clear identity. Perturabo excelled at siegecraft even more than Dorn. I will die on this hill. But his assignments felt like punishment rather than recognition. The lack of purpose there bred resentment. If Perturabo had been given a more clearly defined and celebrated role, akin to how Dorn was assigned as the Praetorian, then maybe Perturabo might have felt a stronger sense of belonging and value. Dorn was emotionally reserved, but even he had allies and positive working relationships, not just among the Primarchs, but also among other human institutions, the Imperial Army, the Imperial Armada, that sort of thing. These bonds were not overly close, but they provided a support network, whereas Perturabo never believed that anyone would accept him for him, so he pushed them away so they wouldn't have the chance to fail him. His relationships with his peers and his own Marines were defined by bitterness, and his relationship with Dorn and some others were defined by rivalry. He lacked anyone who truly understood or supported him. If Perturabo had found a meaningful connection with even one brother, it might have tempered his bitterness and given him an outlet to process his frustrations. We talked earlier about how Perturabo was on a knife edge after Olympia. If he'd had anyone to talk to besides Horus, he might not have fallen. Dorn was respected for his unyielding reliability, and so he was trusted with monumental tasks. Even if he was not beloved as a son, he knew his worth in the Emperor's eyes. Whereas Perturabo believed that his efforts went unnoticed and unappreciated, feeling his sense of inferiority and anger. The lack of recognition for his sacrifices was a deep wound. Remember how we talked about Perturabo thinking that it would be weak to advocate for himself. Thus, Perturabo needed consistent praise, even though he didn't ask for it, and visible acknowledgement of his contributions, even though he didn't ask for it, in order to mitigate his descent into bitterness. Dorn was resilient to criticism. He internalized criticism as a challenge to improve or to prove himself. He channeled it into his duty. He was stubborn, so this didn't happen 100% of the time, but it was a through line. Whereas Perturabo interpreted criticism, or even a lack of praise, as a personal slight, internalizing it as a reinforcement of his own unworthiness. Perturabo needed a framework for understanding constructive criticism, and to trust that his contributions were valued despite imperfections. Perhaps this might have been nurtured through mentorship or validation from his peers and brothers. Dorn's loyalty was built on a profound sense of duty, not just to the Emperor, but to the ideal of the Imperium itself. His sense of self was intertwined with this mission. Perturabo, meanwhile, performed his duties with ruthless efficiency, but he felt like an expendable tool rather than a valued component of the Emperor's vision. Aligning Perturabo's duties with a larger vision he could believe in, maybe rebuilding worlds after war, might have inspired him to see his work as noble rather than drudgery. By applying lessons from Dorn to Perturabo, we can thus see potential areas of intervention. Perturabo needed some autonomy in choosing his campaigns in order to give him a sense of ownership and pride, and also to move him away from the terrible sieges. Perturabo needed public recognition, public celebration of his triumphs, ensuring that his sacrifices were known to his brothers. Dorn's loyalty was rooted in his sense of purpose, recognition, and interpersonal relationships. Even though he was not emotionally expressive, nor was he universally loved, Perturabo lacked these stabilizing factors, and so his emotional wounds deepened as a result. By addressing Perturabo's unmet needs, we might have drawn from Dorn's strengths. We can see how even a deeply bitter and resentful Primarch might have been saved. Dorn's example shows us that loyalty is a choice. It's not just a matter of duty. It's about ensuring that someone's emotional and psychological needs are met within the framework of that duty, so that they can choose to be loyal.
From what I have read of the Horus Heresy novels, I have an observation which I believe lends weight to these ideas about purpose and recognition, evidence that a clearly defined and celebrated role with a great deal of publicly visible responsibility was something he craved. As soon as Perturabo joined Horus, Horus delegated to Perturabo a great deal of strategic responsibility. Perturabo played a large part in the planning of the Istvan betrayals, the march towards Terra, and by the time of the siege of the Imperial Palace, the whole heresy was being run by Perturabo. as Horus was pulled into madness in 4 different directions, and many of the traitor legions were already fracturing into disorganization and self-indulgent massacres and atrocities. Perturabo was the only one organizing them and directing their efforts. In the novels, especially Saturnine, Perturabo loves all this responsibility and authority. This aligns strongly with the idea that Perturabo craved recognition and purpose through a clearly defined and celebrated role. The contrast between how he was treated by the Emperor, and honestly Horus during the Great Crusade, and his experience under Horus during the Horus Heresy, highlights the deep emotional need for validation that defined Perturabo's character. Let's explore how this aspect of his personality played out during the heresy, and what it tells us about him. So, we said before, Horus entrusted Perturabo with the overarching planning of the heresy, including critical operations, like helping him plan the Istvan betrayals and the Siege of Terra. This level of trust and authority fulfilled Perturabo's craving for recognition as a strategic genius, the preeminent strategic genius. As the traitor legions grew increasingly chaotic and self-serving, Perturabo remained disciplined and focused. He became the de facto leader of the rebellion's strategic efforts, managing logistics, directing assaults, and ensuring some semblance of cohesion among the traitors. In the novel Saturnine, we see Perturabo reveling in his role as the mastermind behind the heresy's military campaigns. His satisfaction came from the acknowledgement from the traitors that came with such a central and visible role, and also acknowledgement from his enemies, the loyalists, notably Rogel Dorn, his loyalist counterpart, seeing Perturabo as the great strategic threat against them. From what we can see about this, Perturabo thrived when his role was publicly acknowledged and carried significant weight. He did not simply want to perform his duties, he wanted others to see and respect him for that. This dynamic starkly contrasts with his treatment during the Great Crusade, where his siegecraft and labor were valued but rarely celebrated. He was assigned thankless tasks that left him feeling like an expendable tool rather than a valued architect of the Imperium. Indeed, during the Great Crusade, War Master Horus tricked Perturabo into volunteering his own legion for garrison duties. So not only was he being assigned terrible jobs, the sieges, he was being tricked into volunteering for an additional terrible job. But then during the heresy, the fulfillment he found in Horus's delegation of responsibility shows how deeply he needed recognition. This vulnerability might have led to help from the Emperor or any of his brothers had they understood it during the Great Crusade. The question there is, did Horus already understand that when he tricked Perturabo into offering up his legion for garrison duties? Was he intentionally making Perturabo less satisfied so that he would be less loyal to the Emperor and more loyal to Horus? Thus, despite achieving what he craved in the heresy, responsibility and recognition, Perturabo's allegiance to Horus was ultimately hollow and destructive. Horus was the master manipulator. Fuck Alfarius. He understood Perturabo's need for validation and used it to secure his loyalty, but this validation was transactional. It lacked genuine camaraderie, though it did have a great deal of respect. And then, while Perturabo excelled in his role, it was a Pyrrhic success. It cost his soul and that of his legion. The Siege of Terra, though it was a testament to his genius as he gained victory after victory, grinding down Dorn, it also underscored the futility of his efforts, because not only did they fail, his achievements, had he succeeded, would have only served chaos. Even while serving as Horus's strategist, Perturabo expressed bitterness towards his peers' incompetence and indulgence, such as Abaddon in the novel Saturnine. This means that even in this ideal role, he still felt underappreciated and isolated, and we can see this as chaos manipulating him to avoid healing so that he would be trapped in chaos. What we can see here is that Perturabo's trajectory shows unmet emotional needs festering into resentment and ultimately betrayal. Recognition and validation would have been just as useful to him during the Great Crusade as they were during the heresy. Genuine and consistent validation and acknowledgement could have changed his fate. Perturabo's satisfaction under Horus came from being trusted with significant responsibility. If the Emperor had similarly entrusted him, Perturabo might have felt a greater connection to the Imperium. And Perturabo's lack of close relationships with his brothers made him vulnerable to isolation and manipulation. If another Primarch, not Horus, if another Primarch had forged a bond with him, it might have provided the support he needed to process his frustrations constructively. We talked earlier about if Perturabo had talked to someone else instead of Horus after the massacre at Olympia, perhaps he would not have been pushed towards the traitor's side. Maybe he would not have been recruited by Lorgar before Istvan V. Now, of course, there's the question of, was he already recruited by Horus by the time Lorgar talked to him? Maybe. We'll talk about that when we talk about Lorgar. Anyway, Perturabo's satisfaction during the heresy underscores how much he craved purpose and recognition. Horus exploited this need, and the Emperor and the other Primarchs failed to acknowledge or meet that need during the Great Crusade. Thus, the tragedy of Perturabo lies in how close he came to finding what he needed, but only in a context that doomed him. This shows us that the immense emotional weight of leadership is that even for the most outwardly unfeeling of individuals, their leader needs to be very aware of their emotional needs. Okay, we've talked a little about this. Looking through the Fisher King lens, what imperial institution might be seen as linked to Perturabo? What failings of the post-heresy Imperium could be linked thematically with his fall? I feel is obvious. Perturabo is thematically linked to the Adeptus Administratum, as well as the broader imperial infrastructure and logistics systems, the Munitorum, that sort of thing. These institutions, like Perturabo himself, are defined by their focus on functionality, order, and efficiency, and they completely fail to achieve those things in Warhammer 40,000. They are prone to many of the same failings that led to Perturabo's fall: bitterness, isolation, and being undervalued. The Adeptus Administratum mirrors Perturabo's struggles. It is the backbone of the Imperium's operations, working tirelessly in the shadows to keep the vast bureaucracy running and get resources where they need to go. Yet it is unappreciated, despised for its inefficiencies and flaws, and burdened by the sheer weight of its responsibilities. Perturabo is the preeminent master of logistics and long-term planning. He excelled at tasks requiring precision, intellect, and endurance. Similarly, the Administratum is responsible for managing the immense logistics of the Imperium, trying to ensure that resources, personnel, and orders flow easily across the galaxy where they need to go. Both of them were necessary for the survival of the Imperium and were rarely celebrated or acknowledged. It was a thankless job for Perturabo in the Great Crusade, and it continues to be a thankless job for the Adeptus Administratum in the modern 40k universe. That is to say, just as Perturabo felt underappreciated for his grueling siege campaigns and military genius, the Administratum is criticized for its inefficiencies without recognition of its immense challenges or successes. The institution thus becomes embittered and rigid over time, losing sight of its greater purpose under the weight of its responsibilities, isolating itself, and focusing then on the things which matter emotionally to it at the expense of what matters to the broader Imperium. I'll say that again. Perturabo's isolation from his brothers during the Great Crusade mirrors the Administratum's detachment from the everyday lives of the people it governs. Both are prone to stagnation, prioritizing the continuation of their processes over innovation or adaptation, leading to resentment and eventual failure. That is to say, Perturabo fell, becoming a Daemon Prince, and thus being unable to ever change or improve. He's thematically linked with the Adeptus Administratum. Therefore, the Adeptus Administratum, due to Fisher King rules, suffers his fate, being unable to change or improve. The Administratum has become mired in the weight of its own responsibilities, causing it to be inefficient, ineffective, impersonal, isolated. Instead of innovating or finding ways to alleviate its burdens, which it can't do because it's linked with Perturabo, who has fallen, the Administratum instead focuses on preserving existing systems, even when they are outdated or counterproductive. In at least one of the Cyphus Cain novels, we see the Administratum get real mad when wartime expediency forces them to acknowledge that their lists are out of date, such as the existence or non-existence of assets which could be useful during warfare, but which their lists are wrong about. Anyway, Perturabo became bitter and rigid as he became consumed by the tasks assigned to him, unable to see a way out. That is, until Horus and Lorgar recruited him to chaos. Perturabo's emphasis on pragmatism and efficiency at any cost is also reflected in the Administratum's treatment of the Imperium's citizens as mere statistics. Perturabo treated the Imperial army the way that the Administratum treats everyone. The endless taxation, conscription, exploitation, and lack of care about quality of life echoes Perturabo's cold, calculating approach to warfare, where individuals in the Imperial army were as nothing, pieces on a chessboard to be moved around. Well, it's 40k, pieces on a regicide board. Perturabo's sense of alienation and resentment towards his brothers is mirrored in the Imperium's fractured bureaucracy, where institutions like the Administratum, Mechanicus, and Ecclesiarchy, there we go, often work at cross purposes, with lack of coordination and lack of mutual appreciation within the Imperium's leadership. This echoes Perturabo's isolation and the eventual collapse of his loyalty. Perturabo's fall into bitterness and chaos was partially driven by his frustration with others' inability to appreciate his work or to use it properly. Similarly, the Administratum prioritizes maintaining its processes and traditions over achieving meaningful results. Some functionary might have as their duty to keep some old list of assets and never change it, and to make sure that it is kept in that state forever. The endless bureaucracy, where simple tasks are buried under layers of paperwork and rituals, I encourage you to play the Rogue Trader game, reflects Perturabo's growing obsession with perfection and control. The Rogue Trader RPG video game, There's like a great side quest. Anyway, the Imperium's infrastructure, overseen by the Administratum and Munitorum and other such logistics institutions, suffers from inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation because of the thematic, metaphorical wound left by Perturabo's fall. His expertise in logistics and fortification could have strengthened the Imperium's foundation, both literally and metaphorically. Perturabo's feelings of underappreciation and resentment resonate with the Administratum's role in the Imperium. Both are essential, yet despised, creating a culture of bitterness and alienation within the Imperium's most critical systems. Perturabo's genius for innovation and problem-solving was lost to chaos, leaving the Imperium reliant on outdated systems and processes. The Administratum in particular reflects this loss, as it is unable to adapt or innovate, thus weakening the Imperium over time. Perturabo's relentless focus on duty without recognition mirrors the Administratum's ceaseless labor, serving to maintain the Imperium's survival, but offering little hope or progress for his people. The Adeptus Administratum, with its thankless, grinding work and its critical role in maintaining the Imperium, serves as the perfect Fisher King institution linked to Perturabo. Its bureaucratic stagnation, inefficiency, dehumanization, isolation, and bitterness about his role are mirrored by Perturabo's own descent into despair, betrayal, and the stagnation that comes with daemonhood. This wounded foundation of the Imperium reflects the loss of Perturabo's brilliance and vision, leaving behind an empire that functions but is forever diminished. Now, there are some other matters we could discuss further with regards to Perturabo. What was the impact of Olympia and the rejection of him by his people? We could examine in greater detail how the betrayal of his people on Olympia affected his outlook on trust, loyalty, and leadership. Further, his early experiences with rejection from his father might have left a lasting mark on his emotional development, which we have alluded to, but not addressed with any particular textual examples. What was the Iron Warrior's role in the Siege of Terra? Analyzing Perturabo's role in the Siege of Terra might potentially provide insights into his sense of duty and the complex emotions he felt during his conflict. His often overlooked contributions, notably Abaddon did not respect him enough, and his feelings of being underappreciated, again, Abaddon, could shed light on his internal struggles. What about the relationships with his other brothers? We talked a bit about his rivalry with Dorn. What were Perturabo's relationships with other Primarchs, who he viewed as competitors or viewing them as undermining him? Perhaps looking at them might provide a deeper look at his sense of isolation and his tendency to view loyalty as transactional. What was the role of failure and perfectionism in Perturabo's emotional landscape? Perturabo's obsession with perfection and his struggle with failure might be discussed in greater depth. How did he reconcile his need for flawless victories and flawless performance with the constant setbacks that surrounded him, particularly the broader imperial institutions failing to give adequate support to his legion due to his legion's reputation? Perhaps we might look at how Perturabo viewed the broader goals and ideals of the Imperium, especially the Emperor's vision of the Imperium versus his own expectations for his own legion. Maybe that might give us insight into the reasons behind his eventual fall to chaos. How much of his rebellion was driven by his idealism being shattered? As always, I want you to leave a comment about what you think should be addressed with Perturabo, and then I want you to make your own video. I'd love to watch it.